Well, hello, good morning, everybody, and welcome to day two of this year's Policy Forum on Identity Authentication and the Road Ahead. I'm Jeremy Grant. I'll be your MC again today. I'm Managing Director in Venables Cybersecurity and Privacy Practice, and I also serve as coordinator of the Better Identity Coalition and an advisor to FIDO Alliance. Along with the ID Theft Resource Center, these three groups are excited to partner on what has become what we think is the best event each year, looking at a range of policy issues around identity and authentication. Yesterday, we had a great set of discussions that focused heavily on the impact of the pandemic on digital identity, looking at how the elimination of in-person transactions and the availability of trillions of dollars of aid fueled record identity theft and fraud. We also had some good talks about the very real impact that all of this has had on individuals, looking at how the identity systems we put in place don't always work so well for a lot of our fellow Americans, and talking about what we need to do as both government and industry to address these issues. We also had an excellent panel exploring where government can help, looking at new initiatives like mobile driver's licenses, attribute validation services, as well as how a bill that's in the House, the Improving Digital Identity Act, can ensure there's a coordinated approach across all levels of government to solving this problem. Today's program is going to continue to explore many of the themes we touched on yesterday. This morning's largely going to focus on authentication. Everyone wants passwords to be dead, but they have somehow very stubbornly refused to go away. Over the weekend, I got word one of my email passwords had been compromised, and now for the third time in 6 months, I need to come up with a new name for my cat. It's the problem with virtual events. You don't hear anybody laughing, or maybe nobody was laughing. Maybe nobody thought it was a good joke. Anyways, thank you. Somebody in the comments said, ha, 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 ha. Look, we're going to start this morning with a keynote I'm really excited about. Eric Mill from the White House, who's going to discuss the government's new zero trust strategy and the role that strong phishing-resistant authentication like FIDO plays in it. And then Andrew Shikyar, who serves as the executive director of FIDO Alliance, will provide some perspectives from the industry side. The FIDO Alliance is a great example of how industry has been collaborating with government to deliver better authentication solutions that aren't just more secure, but that are also easier for people to use. We'll then shift to a panel on how government and industry are rethinking authentication, hosted by my venerable colleague, Grant Schneider, who's also the former US government CISO. The panel will feature speakers from both DHS and Microsoft, as well as from a firm, Guidehouse, that's working very closely with a number of agencies to help them modernize authentication. We'll take a short break, as we did yesterday, around 12:45, get a bite to eat, stretch your legs. We'll then kick off the afternoon with a panel looking at next generation digital ID proofing, with a particular focus on the ways that artificial intelligence is being used to more effectively detect and block attacks. AI offers some great benefits, but its use has also raised a lot of policy concerns around potential bias and accuracy issues. This panel is going to explore how AI is being used today and how companies in the space are taking proactive approaches to tackle potential bias and accuracy issues, and also discuss the role that policymakers can play in ensuring that as we're looking at using more AI-enabled identity tools, we can have a framework in place to deliver maximum benefit and minimum risk. We're then going to shift to three sessions that are going to be getting different government perspectives. First, we have a spotlight session set up with the FDIC's Chief Innovation Officer, Sultan Megji, and Kate Turner, who's the lead for digital identity at FinCEN. Just last week, they announced plans to host a tech sprint focused on measuring the effectiveness of digital ID proofing for digital financial services. And they'll be talking a little bit about that tech sprint and how things will work and how they see things rolling out with it today. From there, we're going to hear from Assistant Treasury Secretary Liz Rosenberg, who was just confirmed last month in her role. She's the Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes at the Treasury Department, basically making her the Treasury's point person for making sure the financial system can't be exploited by adversaries, be they criminals, terrorists, or other countries. Identity is a really important issue for Treasury, I think, with regard to both the ability of financial services firms and government to know who's actually engaging in transactions, and also to ensure that criminals and terrorists can't exploit weak identity controls to move money. And beyond security, digital identity is also really key, both to enabling innovation in financial services and also improving financial inclusion. So I'm excited to hear what Liz has to say today. We'll then end our day with what is a late addition to our panel. We got word last night that Carol House is able to join us. So for those of you who don't know Carol, she serves as the Director for Cybersecurity and Secure Digital Innovation at the White House National Security Council, the NSC, and she's been leading work there in the NSC on digital identity issues. So given the wide array of topics that we've covered in the last few days and the focus of this forum on looking at what we call the road ahead. I'm thrilled Carol will be able to come in and offer some closing remarks. So with that, let's get things kicked off. Our first speaker this morning is Eric Mill, who is Senior Advisor to the Federal Chief Information Officer in the Biden-Harris administration. In 2019, Eric served on the Senate Committee on Rules and Administration's Democratic staff as a Senior Technology Advisor on Election Security. Before that, he had a great stint at the GSA, where he led a number of government-wide technology policy initiatives and also oversaw the development of login.gov, which we talked about quite a bit yesterday. So with that, welcome, Eric. Glad you could be with us today.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. All right, I will go ahead and share my screen here. All right, are we all shared? Okay, I'll assume yes. All right, well, thank you so much for having me. So as Jeremy mentioned, I work for the Office of Management and Budget. I work for the part of the Office of Management and Budget. I work for the Federal Chief Information Officer. We oversee the IT and cybersecurity practices of federal agencies and of how federal agencies operate and how they deliver on their missions through technology. So today I want to talk about strong authentication in the US government and beyond. And I say and beyond, not because I could speak for other organizations, but because one of the key concepts in this that I'm going to talk about is really about ensuring alignment and interoperability between the US government and the rest of the world, making sure that we are not an island. So right now, the federal government is in the middle of a cybersecurity overhaul. There are a huge number of activities going on relating to cybersecurity across the whole government. 2021 was a very busy year on this front. 2022 looks to be just as busy. There are too many pieces of that effort to talk about. I'm going to focus on one of those efforts today, which is OMB's Zero Trust strategy. And I'm going to focus on a particular part of that, which is our emphasis on authentication. I think it's worth emphasizing as we talk about doing things to improve the security of large, complicated enterprises, it's always a daunting task. It's important to remember that security is rarely, if ever, about any kind of perfect protection or about creating something that is unhackable or is just a perfect perimeter. What we need to be able to do in security, and particularly in enterprise security, is to raise the costs to adversaries to make it through, whether just to make it so there are fewer of those attacks, to reduce the number that are successful, to deter them in the first place by making it not worth their while, and shrink the impact and number of those things in a way that stabilizes the world that we live in. And to do that, we really need to be looking for opportunities to raise these costs, not by incremental amounts, not at the margins, but looking for places where we can do order of magnitude improvements. I think it's also important to understand that security and usability, people have a way of seeing them as in conflict. Maybe people often in their lives, can experience increased security as in some way inconveniencing them in their lives, in their personal lives, in their work lives. And so they do get to be seen as in conflict, but they are not always in conflict. And whenever we have an opportunity to do both, to improve security and usability at the same time, we really need to take it. So that'll be another theme of what we talk about. So OMB released, and this is a screenshot of our website, where over the fall we published a draft federal zero trust strategy. The final version will be coming out soon and will include everything I'm talking about in this presentation. This zero trust strategy is something that we have published partly as one of the lines of work in the cybersecurity executive order, with a whole range of initiatives. And some policy requirements, some pilot initiatives, some normative language, pushing the federal government and civilian agencies in the direction of what many people call a zero trust architecture, which to very pithily try to sum that up, revolves around really strong, a more sophisticated approach to least privilege, to moving away from a perimeter, especially a network perimeter inside organizations, and moving away from creating kind of a safe internal space where people and devices move around freely, and instead creating an environment where people and their devices are verified all throughout the process, and that anomalous patterns or unusual activity are noticed, and eventually organizations can move to a place where they are automatically monitoring and enforcing on more sophisticated rules and permissions than they're able to do today. That is certainly an incomplete description, as this is sort of a wide-ranging initiative, and it can be a fuzzy term. But we have really laid out what we think are the most important priorities in this area and what the federal government's strategy for getting there will be. So I encourage you to go look at it. And so as part of this, we have made one of our key priorities defense against phishing. Phishing is one of the most common ways that footholds are gotten in an enterprise for an adversary. And we really want to focus on having clear order of magnitude better defenses against that kind of attack. And so I may be preaching to the choir a little bit here, but I want to take just a couple slides here and show the threat model specifically that we are really talking about here, as we're trying to approach it with this in mind. So we are very concerned about phishing as it is practiced today in the 2020s, where we have automated, cheap, scalable, high-scale phishing services that can convincingly pretend to be a website to the user, and can convincingly pretend to be a browser to the real website. So these phishing services can play both parts when they need to. So they can have it, and we are concerned about the kinds of multi-factor authentication out there that do not protect against phishing the way it is practiced today. So if somebody has been successfully fooled into coming to a phishing site that is convinced the user that they're the real site, there's no reason to think that the user wouldn't enter a one-time code along with their password into that phishing site. And the phishing site, because it can also pretend to be a browser to the real website that it's spoofing, the phishing site could just be a completely automated, hands-off process of passing that stuff along, with the real website participating and sending the user the real one-time code because it thinks a real browser is approaching it. I think much of this audience probably understands this dynamic. I do want to emphasize as well, that we're quite aware that push notifications that can be defeated in the same way. These are things where instead of being given a one-time code, a user's phone may be given an approve or reject push notification where the user can just hit a button and get into the site. Certainly some very clear usability benefits there, but we are concerned about the possibility, and we see clear reporting about phishing sites also taking advantage of the weaknesses in these methods. And though it's a little bit different than somebody entering a one-time code, it really is a matter of, since the user believes they are logging into the real phishing site, there really is no reason that they wouldn't hit the approve or reject button, or they wouldn't hit the approve button to get in. And we've certainly seen reports of adversaries who have come across somebody's password, just going and trying to log into their website, just causing the push notification to be delivered to somebody's phone out of band and just hoping that they'll hit approve. And sometimes that works. So it's with this threat model in mind that we are trying to create a clear baseline among civilian federal agencies around not using multi-factor authentication methods that don't resist phishing in this way. Which includes one-time code methods, such as are typically practiced with SMS, various versions of OTP, push notifications. So what that means is in the federal government, we do have PIV, personal identity verification. People are most commonly used to seeing that in the card form that many employees carry around with them. I have one sitting on my computer right now. The federal government is fortunate to have PIV, and has been fortunate to have this for many years, as the PIV's use of client certificates actually does break the phishing threat model that I just talked about and does defend against phishing. What we're also trying to do here at the same time as we're restricting the use of multi-factor methods that don't resist phishing. We're really specifically calling for broadening the use of other kinds of phishing-resistant methods, and that's FIDO2 and WebAuthn in the real world, into federal agencies alongside PIV. And this is, we're trying to be really as clear as we possibly can that this is something that agencies, can and should be doing now, for a number of reasons, and including for the things that have made PIV successful at defending against phishing in its use of client certificates at a PKI also do create interoperability challenges with certain kinds of systems in the 15, 20 years since PKI and client certificates were first kind of brought into the web and internet ecosystem. So we really expect to see PIV and FIDO and WebAuthn based authenticators in commingled use through the federal government and other weaker methods, weaker in the context of phishing specifically, discontinued. So this is a sort of a clear line and decision that we're making here. And I do also want to mention that NIST is working to formally accommodate a broader range of authenticators as they update the derived PIV spec. For those who follow this space closely and know their NIST special publications and FIPS publications by heart, FIPS 201-3 was published just published yesterday formally, and lays the groundwork for some of this. So more to come on that. We're also in the vein here of interoperability across contexts. So we are also talking some about public authentication. For the most part, our zero trust strategy is really focused on enterprise security, but this is really something where enterprise security and public security are connected. There really is not a way to disentangle them entirely. And as a matter of course, the general public needs many options and for them to be able to access government services in an equitable fashion. So what we're doing here is requiring that public-facing services in the civilian government that use multi-factor authentication and offer that to external non-government employees include the option of FIDO2 and WebAuthn. The position we're taking here is that we're adding options and not imposing restrictions, and so it should be a strict equity and accessibility upside here, but we want to make sure that the federal government is offering people the options that they would need to protect themselves from phishing if they want to and can use that method. It's also just it's like I said, it's not that easy to draw clear lines between enterprise and public context when it comes to this stuff, particularly because in the federal government, we have a lot of services that sort of cross both of these lines. There's a lot of partner interactions that the federal government has. There's a lot of use cases where the federal government has services that are not used by the whole general public, but by specific subsets. Maybe they're contractors, maybe they're state and local agencies. It's going to be important for us to be able to use the same things as people span different systems. And that's part of what having industry standards like this is all about. And I'll also mention, we are also making it clear that it's not appropriate to collect data about the make and model of the user's device, the technical term for that being attestation in a non-enterprise context. And that it's important that users have their own choice of authenticators out on the public internet. And so for public-facing systems, really discouraging agencies from collecting attestation data. So one last bit here, I'll talk about the requirements, which is a fairly small one, but we remain enthusiastic about the potential for passwordlessness, just like I'm sure the rest of this crowd is, in government services as well. We certainly see that as part of the future of where the government should go. As Jeremy mentioned earlier, passwords are not dead yet, and when they are in use, there are some sort of long overdue things that we need to clean up and how we manage strong passwords in the federal government, which are regular password rotation, making people change their password every 90 days, every 120 days, regardless of whether there's been a security incident of some kind, and special character requirements, forcing people to use uppercase, lowercase, special characters, numbers, These have at this point been widely studied and demonstrated to reduce security as well as reduce usability. And so this is one of those opportunities that we have to improve security and usability at the same time. And these have been laid out pretty clearly by NIST now in their digital identity standards for several years, and we're really doubling down on these as quite firmly. So I want to talk just a little bit here about like kind of a looking forward mentality here. So in addition to, we've just talked about what we're doing and what we're hoping to achieve for multi-factor authentication in enterprise and public contexts. More generally, we're very excited about where this field is going. Particularly excited about, to use a technical term here, platform authenticators, right? Using onboard devices, these authenticators that are baked into the the laptops and phones that regular people already have in their lives. And these are where the action is going to be for most people, right? It's unlikely to be the case that we'll have everybody carrying portable security keys around on their keychain and keeping a backup in at home somewhere or a safe deposit box. While that is a pattern you'll see a lot of sort of security-minded power users take today, that's unlikely to be the pattern that is used by mainstream people on the internet, including the ones that are using government services they need to get into and that need to be secure. So we're really excited about platform authenticators. But their potential really remains very unexplored. I have a screenshot up here, by the way, of login.gov, which recently has released a dedicated UX workflow for platform authenticators. So I've screenshotted here so you can see it's, so in terms of what I'm referring to with platform authenticators, this is an example in the screenshot of Windows Hello, of using the onboard fingerprint reader to log into a website instead of just logging into your laptop itself. And so to talk a little bit about this, there's an opportunity here to enable some very new user experiences. Like, we haven't really had the opportunity to revisit assumptions around how users log into systems for a long time. There's some extremely standard UX patterns for logging into websites that we at this point, many people have sort of stopped thinking about. And so over the last few years, a number of ways that people have really started integrating things like FIDO2 and even platform authenticators have been essentially grafted on as a second factor method. Obviously, as we move towards passwordlessness, there are in those situations, it's not going to be used as a second factor necessarily. This really feels like a space where we have the web APIs and the sort of the interaction now between different layers of the UX stack. We have the participation of the operating system, we have the participation of a secure enclave, we have the participation of the browser and the website, all speaking the same language. And so we really have an opportunity to try out new patterns. And there's a period now where we have all this together where we should be encouraging creativity and finding what those new best practices are. And with an eye over time here towards taking some of the patterns that we find and grounding them in usability research, finding the ones that work measurably well in the real world, and starting to make a point to coalesce around the terms that we find that are understandable to people and the patterns that seem to work well. So this is a the sort of expansion and then coalescing is something that we see likely to happen over the next few years and think is very positive for both the enterprise and the public-facing context. We also really are keeping quite an eye towards clearly communicating some really key properties of particularly platform authenticators, though these apply to WebAuthn generally. I think many of the folks on this call, in this conference, understand that the way that for authentication, the way that biometrics are implemented, they never leave the device. The user is really just authenticating themselves to their own device, to their laptop and to their phone. And that laptop or phone is then just sort of vouching to the website that the user did that. They're not passing on the biometric information. We also know that because because of what I just described, how you're authenticating themselves to your own device, it doesn't actually have to be a biometric. It really can be any other way that you unlock your device. Folks broadly expect that for most people, it's going to be the easiest way to use a biometric, but there is the option of using other things. And for some people, that can be very important. And some people that can be absolutely critical. From an equity perspective, this is not only just a simpler user experience in general, but onboard platform authenticators like this really also mean that there's not a need to own another device. And that in and of itself is an accessibility and equity improvement. These properties are just not obvious or intuitive to everyone. And one of the things that in this space that we all are going to need to be sensitive to, and I can assure you, the US government will be especially sensitive about it, is really making sure these things are understood by the general public, particularly about their privacy, by just general society and policymakers. It's really, these are hard-won things in this space that people should understand are true. So I think that will be one of the things this ecosystem will be exploring. And I think one of the things in this space that I know many folks in the ecosystem are very cognizant of, but has not yet really been solved are, this concept of what it means for this actually to blow up in a real way for regular people all over the internet, and what it means when it comes time where you have your laptop registered to 60, 100 sites, and then you change your laptop, and then or you drop a phone in the ocean or whatever it might be. Those are solutions. Those are semi-open problems in this space that I know many organizations are working on solving at the moment. And it will just be really important to keep privacy, user choice, and equity in mind as we do that. So I just want to end on a couple of notes here, and if there's time, I'm happy to take a few questions. We're really trying to get across that when it comes to authentication, the security of enterprises and the general public, they're inextricably interconnected. And we are, from a strategic perspective, we're really trying to approach it that way. And the other thing that is maybe just a general point here is that we really can't keep doing things the way that we always have, or just sort of taking an incremental step and adding on a new thing, but kind of mostly doing things the way that we always have. Like there are some of the stuff we talked about in this presentation are major changes that are uncomfortable for organizations, for companies, and it represents the size of the gap that we're staring at that we need to cross for online security, for enterprise security, and speaking for the federal government here, for the federal government security. These are major gaps, and we need to be willing to look past some of the preconceptions that we've had about how things need to go. And so hopefully you see that reflected in our strategy. So happy to turn it over from there to questions, and thanks again for having me here to speak today.
Great. Thanks, Eric. I know we got time for a couple of questions I see in the queue. So the first one is one I think is on a lot of people's minds, which is the zero trust strategy is in draft. Can you speak to when it may be released in its final form, as well as how long agencies will have to become compliant with the MFA requirements?
It will be released soon. I'll just put the word soon in bold and maybe italicize it. It will be released soon, and the things that I covered in this presentation, I was not caveating as part of the draft, and you will see in the final version.
All right. And the second part of that question, once it's out, what happens next? How long do agencies have to become compliant? How are things going to work there?
So actually, I'm glad you asked that. So there will be some more information on timelines in the final version than we're in the draft. But at a high level, we're really looking at, it's not just about multi-factor authentication. We're looking at a major architectural shift for the federal government. And so we know that's a multi-year process. And so we're trying to both design an oversight and timing process that reflects the urgency with which we need to move, and the reality of the size of the work that is happening. So we generally, at a high level, agencies will be asked to provide multi-year plans for what they're going to do, which will include MFA and authentication as one of the components of the work that they're doing. And there's also going to be some things that we would really expect to see on the earlier parts of that multi-year plan. And so while I don't want to comment exactly on the MFA requirements in this context, what I would say is we're trying to balance both some short-term urgency as well as some long-term urgency, which is tricky to do, but I think is the reality of what we're dealing with.
Thanks. And there was one other question, which was, how does this work if, I have a device in the government that's shared across, a few different workers, given that you talk about platform authenticators, but, what might they do for phishing resistant authentication?
Yeah, so that's a great point. And it is absolutely a way to emphasize the need for different options and the fact that there is not one UX pattern and there's not one particular kind of authenticator that's going to work for everybody. In that particular context, or you were talking about shift workers, folks who are working for an organization, and for folks in an enterprise context, that is a possibility for the enterprise to be able to supply them with things that can help meet their needs. And so that's one of the reasons that I think we are able to make some distinguishing here between what's appropriate for enterprise policy and what's appropriate for public use. But I think that is an excellent question that needs to be considered as different patterns evolve in the space of how many devices should folks be registering before it's okay to be passwordless. Do you need a balance of platform and portable? How do other methods fit in public use cases or in non-federal enterprises? That's not something I can answer in a simple way on this call, but it is something that the ecosystem has to answer collectively.
Great. Thanks. I know we're right at time now. Really appreciate you coming to speak today. Thanks so much also for the great work you're doing over in the White House. This is exciting to see, and we'll be excited to see the final strategy emerge in the days ahead.
Thanks so much. Take care.
Again. So now we're going to turn things from Eric over to Andrew Shikiar, who's the Executive Director of FIDO Alliance, who I think will talk about work that's happening between government and industry to help transform the way we do authentication. Hopefully can provide some additional color on some of the themes that Eric just hit. So thank you. Andrew, over to you.
Jeremy, thanks so much. It is great to be here. And I'm actually flattered to follow Eric's opening comments, which are a great segue into our conversation today, which is about providing unphishable multi-factor authentication for everyone. I've spoken at this event the past few years. For those of you who have attended, this will provide you with updates on the substantial progress FIDO Alliance and the industry's made over the course of 2021. For those of you who are newer to FIDO, I hope this talk gives you a good feel for the imperative that FIDO is seeking to address, which fundamentally is the need not just for what I'll call check the box multi-factor authentication, but a truly unphishable foundation to secure a variety of connected services that are critical to today's networked society. Sadly, one thing I can always count on when giving this sort of presentation is a relevant and a recent example of a remote attack on sensitive resources. And sure enough, just last week, we saw a phishing attack on the Department of Labor. Elsewhere in the world, Singapore has been rocked by an SMS phishing scheme where hackers send SMS messages that actually had phishing links to OCBC banking customers. The monetary authority of Singapore is now scrambling to implement new regulations on SMS-oriented banking communications, while thousands of customers are trying to recover tens of millions of dollars. And frankly, I could probably spend all 25 minutes today talking about recent examples of remote attacks. And to that end, I'm going to make some bold predictions for 2022. The first is not so bold, which is that phishing attacks will continue to succeed. I think Eric, laid out, how phishing works quite elegantly. But ultimately, phishing attacks will grow because they work, right? And phishers, in addition to causing chaos, like making money. Phishing attacks are relatively cheap to execute, and they have a staggering success rate, right? So a well-designed phishing attack, spear phishing attack, has over a 50% success rate. That's not a click rate, a success rate of someone actually getting phished. So with those odds and a little bit of investment, it's a quick way for hackers to take over accounts and make a couple bucks. But that's not really new. In fact, I could have made this precise prediction for the past several years and be batting 1,000. But my bolder prediction for 2022 is that MFA bypass attacks will become mainstream. And that's what Eric actually laid out in that diagram, showing how man-in-the-middle or relay attacks can actually enable this, fooling the legitimate site and the user alike into thinking that they're a legitimate interface to that site. This will become more and more normal, which we've already seen in 2022. What are we, 25 days into 2022? Two massive brands have suffered MFA bypass attacks on their customers, both EA and Crypto.com, costing tens of millions of virtual dollars. And the risk here is that people will kind of confuse these bypass attacks with more modern MFA, which is actually prevents phishing, as Eric talked about, as I'll detail further in my conversation today. So I think that's going to be something to watch in 2022 for certain. Now, there's also it's not all doom and gloom. There's plenty of good news too. In general, I think there's more awareness of the inherent risk of passwords. And in fact, Gartner has cited passwordless authentication as a now activity, encouraging enterprises to deploy passwordless this year, and citing FIDO and FIDO security keys as the preferred method. And I think this sort of guidance and this sort of awareness is one reason why, on an adjacent topic, it's one reason why we've seen so much venture capital investment going into the digital identity landscape. I know that our vendors and FIDO Alliance are as busy as can be, struggling to keep up with all the demand, which is certainly a great problem for them to have. So we'll see this space grow as we move forward into 2022 and beyond the enterprise. I'm going to predict that mobile platforms will provide consumer-ready solutions that can scale later this year. So basically enabling the promise of platform authenticators that Eric talked to, we already have today, but allowing that to scale even further through innovations in these device platforms. So stay tuned for more information from our stakeholders on that front later in 2022. But ultimately, a fundamental shift is required in the way that we authenticate. And Eric touched on some of this. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail. We need to move from kind of knowledge-based credentialing to more modern possession-based credentialing. So knowledge-based stuff, of course, these are things and this is how we've always accessed online services. You put a password on the server. If you remember it and you enter it, you're granted access. Of course, a phisher could do the same thing. So knowledge-based authentication or passwords, anything that in your head, it's stored in a server. It can include OTP messages. A lot of the problem actually starts at account creation, identity proofing based on knowledge-based sources. Now, this is kind of the legacy means of credentialing and authentication that we need to move away from. The preferred approach is possession-based, right? Something in your hand, on your device. This can be your on-device biometric. This can be your local PIN. This also includes more modern ways of actually creating accounts, which we'll talk about in a little bit. The fundamental difference between these two things is that knowledge-based credentialing and knowledge-based authentication is susceptible to remote attacks and common threats, whereas modern authentication, modern MFA, possession-based authentication is truly phishing resistant. And that's, the direction we need to head in, because ultimately, this check the box legacy MFA simply won't cut it for much longer. So if that's the approach the enterprise is taking, they're going to find themselves needing to upgrade their approach in the near future. And frankly, the legacy approach isn't really needed, as the availability and scalability of unphishable FIDO-based solutions continue to grow and be more prevalent on the market today. Backing up a little bit, FIDO's goal from day one has been to transform the way that the market authenticates users from a dependence on centrally stored shared secrets to a more decentralized model that allows users to authenticate through the devices that they literally have at their fingertips every day. It's simpler, stronger authentication, leveraging user-friendly, asymmetric public key cryptography. So the goal is to be both more secure and easier to use than passwords and legacy MFA, such as OTPs alike. And FIDO's made great goal in creating these standards We've released several sets of specifications since 2015, and the technologies have seen rapid adoption both in products and in real-world services, which continues to grow and scale every month of the year. A little bit about FIDO Alliance itself. We are an industry body. We have over 250 organizations taking part in FIDO Alliance. This is our board of directors, so over 40 companies, which really reflects the general composition of the FIDO Alliance membership itself, which is one reason why I think we've been able to have such a strong sense of collaboration and strong sense of accomplishment. We basically have three key constituencies in FIDO Alliance. First, we have the companies that create the platforms and devices that we all use every day, from chipsets on up to handsets. All those companies are involved in FIDO Alliance, invested in our efforts, and collaborating well within the organization. Secondly, we have experts in biometrics and identity, authentication, security. Both longtime stalwarts companies who have been doing this for decades, as well as a host of really innovative growth stage startup companies who are bringing fresh ideas into the mix. Then last but not least, we have the service providers whose businesses really rely on their ability to securely deliver services to billions of users worldwide. So these are the payment networks, the e-commerce providers, social media giants, the telcos, the banks, you name it. So they bring the requirements into the alliance, and then they collaborate with all the other members to build our specifications and our other outputs as well. Eric mentioned a couple of things earlier, spelled out a couple of requirements he wants to see, industry work on. That's what we're doing. And it's interesting to see his emphasis on usability. More and more, I find that I can't talk about FIDO, or you can't spell FIDO or authentication without talking about UX. And so we've invested a lot in that space as well, considering usability, considering inclusivity as we build out our specifications and related guidance as an organization. And overall, we're making good progress as FIDO Alliance and as an industry. A couple of key data points, where we sit at the end of 2021. First, we have over 850 FIDO certified products. And I'm not going to get too deep into certification today because we're don't have enough time. But the FIDO certified program is an absolutely critical component of what FIDO Alliance does. These products are certified that not just do they adhere to the technical specifications, but also they test to be proven to be interoperable, right? So a FIDO2 server will work with a FIDO2 authenticator. And that really brings the benefits of open standards to agencies and organizations that choose to deploy FIDO certified solutions, right? So you can bring a best of breed solution that's future-proofed for future changes in the underlying technologies. So anyone who's looking to deploy FIDO, I'd encourage you to look for FIDO certified products and services. Secondly, a great data point, over 5 billion devices support FIDO, right? This represents basically every modern operating system and browser on the market. I'll talk more about that in just a moment. And last but not least, we're seeing hundreds of millions of people using passwordless methods, including FIDO, to access services each month. And that 150 million plus, that actually just represents Microsoft account, right? So Microsoft recently announced that Microsoft account holders can ditch their passwords. But in addition to that, we're seeing many other organizations enable FIDO passwordless solutions for their consumers and for their employees. And ultimately, for FIDO to achieve our audacious goal of providing simpler, stronger authentication for all, we need to have endpoint support. This has been a focus of the Alliance since our inception, and we've collaborated with W3C and other groups to help address this need, which has led to the work with W3C and WebAuthn led to broad support for FIDO in every major modern web browser. Additionally, the fact that we have all of the major operating system vendors and device vendors as core stakeholders in FIDO, they've now built FIDO natively, native FIDO support into all their devices, right? So every modern Android, Windows, Apple device supports FIDO authentication. That means virtually every device being unboxed this very moment and throughout today and moving forward has built-in support for FIDO. And that really sets the stage for industry to move beyond passwords and adopt this phishing-resistant MFA at scale. And to that end, we are seeing broad adoption. This is a very small subset of the types of organizations that are deploying FIDO. It's meant to give you a feel for the breadth and depth of use cases and companies and geographies where FIDO is being deployed. Literally every sector and every region is deploying FIDO to secure, citizen, enterprise, and government resources. So since this is a policy summit, I want to look a little bit closer at, FIDO's imperative in government and where we fit therein. I think the government imperative in many ways is similar to that of industry, but there's also some distinct requirements. And Eric touched on some of those. He talked about the zero trust strategy from OMB. But at a high level, one imperative is to protect accounts for citizens and employees. Right? Fundamentally, this is the weakness of passwords and knowledge-based authentication, and the strength of FIDO's approach. Right? Finding a way to secure these accounts from remote attacks. Secondly, we need to create simpler sign-in experiences. Eric talked about the availability of platform authenticators, and that certainly is a simpler approach to logging into things. Again, using the device that's in your hand. But also, this should probably be expanded to say simpler and inclusive sign-in experiences. It's very interesting listening to some of the sessions yesterday, understanding that the breadth of requirements that, say, the federal government needs to consider when you think about people accessing government services. Citizens accessing government services can come from anything from a modern PC onto like a shared terminal in a library. And so this needs to be considered also as you think about, how do you leverage these modern standards to, help secure access to online services. Then lastly, it's important to enable trust in the broader government ecosystem. I think that trust is often overlooked when it comes to authentication, but ultimately it's a core element for all constituents, whether that's employees or citizens, agencies, partners, suppliers. They need to have confidence in the integrity of the systems that they're depending on, whether it's a matter of accessing your personal records or enabling requisition. Trust needs to be there, and trust ultimately is enforced through better security and authentication hygiene and best practices. Another thing that's interesting about FIDO and government is that it really brings a new paradigm for user authentication. It's great to hear Eric talk about the need to make fundamental change and not to be stuck in our past ways. And I think that's really the mindset that everyone needs to take when you're thinking about how to keep ahead of the hackers and how to deploy modern authentication. FIDO offers this, right? We offer newer, better options for strong authentication, but frankly speaking, governments have had to update some policies to support the ways in which FIDO is different. Ultimately, as technology evolves, policy needs to evolve with it. And sometimes there's kind of a lag time between those things happening. But it's been great to see, so many different government bodies actually focusing closely on digital identity and authentication, updating policies accordingly to modernize systems, modernize regulations to better protect society at large. And to wit, when FIDO started engaging with governments back in 2015, most governments had not heard of FIDO. And in fact, many were just implementing or finalizing even regulations that were, very focused on OTP or PKI, right? And that was the kind of traditional way of thinking about authentication, because that's really all that was out there. But as we fast forward to 2022, not only are more governments aware of FIDO, but they're actively driving conversation on the delineation between legacy MFA and phishing-resistant multi-factor authentication. And again, if there's one takeaway from this talk, I hope you all take, is that that's the line that we all need to draw, the difference between legacy MFA and modern phishing-resistant MFA. I should note, that a lot of our progress here is thanks to the good work that Venable has done. So thanks to the Venable team for helping drive some of this awareness. And as a result, we're seeing a growing trend of government recognition of FIDO authentication. Right, it's often cited in government guidance documents, as Eric talked about earlier, and others will speak to you later today. Outside the U.S., we see groups like the Australian Cybersecurity Center The UK Government Digital Service and Cabinet Office explicitly recommending utilization of FIDO security keys. We see great progress also in parts of Asia, such as Korea, Taiwan, Thailand, all citing FIDO as kind of core to their approach for agency and user authentication. In general, I think identity is coming to the fore in government. I love this first image there you see in the top left, back from April 2019, but identity is now seen as critical infrastructure. So there's digital identity right alongside things like the nation's power grid, right? So it's great to see the federal government recognizing the importance of digital identity to our nation's security. You also see the CISA references, and here we see that the Biden executive order on multi-factor authentication. A lot of stuff's happening here in the U.S., but also outside the U.S. There are critical identity initiatives also taking place, including EIDAS and national identity wallets in Europe. So identity, digital identity in government continues to be a focus area and will be even more so as we move forward over the next couple of years. And we're thrilled to see this guidance, on multi-factor authentication from CISA just last week, I believe. FIDO security keys were cited as the gold standard of multi-factor authentication. And of course, we couldn't agree more. FIDO security keys, inside enterprise are perfect use to help protect sensitive resources. This is actually a good opportunity also to thank Jen Easterly and her team there for the work they're doing to protect this nation's infrastructure. So thank you. And then Eric talked at length about this, but for those of you who may be a little bit later joining, I see we have some new participants joining. Eric talked a lot about the OMB's focus on phishing resistance, but it's worth highlighting some of these aspects of the zero trust strategy. Specifically, the push on any phishing-resistant multi-factor authentication for agency workers, and also as an option for public users. And look, PIV and CAC are great and fully secure, of course. But the fact of the matter is that FIDO security keys from companies such as Yubico, OneSpan, Fatium, and many others, they present a lower friction option, ready to deploy option for agencies who are seeking to implement FIDO authentication in rapid fashion. So very thrilled to see this, and we think it opens up the opportunity for more agencies to protect their core constituents, and also for our stakeholders in the FIDO certified ecosystem to provide solutions to these agencies. So to start to wrap things up, I'd like to take a look at a few of FIDO's objectives. The first of which is to become part of the web's DNA. And this is an objective because it's necessary for a mission to become successful, right? Passwords are part of our lives because they're ubiquitous and they're part of the web's DNA. Simply put, we need to supplant them. We need to kick them out of that role and take their place. There are 3 steps that any technology need to take to achieve this goal of becoming part of the web's DNA. The first is industry standardization and collaboration, right? And this is part of FIDO's nature. So we're doing quite well there. We have so many stakeholders inside the organization, but also we're very keen and actively collaborate outside of FIDO Alliance, right? So we liaise with other standards groups like W3C, like OpenID Foundation, EMVCO, and many others to address adjacent use cases, to drive market education, and really to establish best practices in security, identity, and authentication. So that's a key component that we've taken to help become part of the web's DNA. A second key step is just to be shipping at scale. You need to be there. You need to have the dial tone effect where the technology is readily available to be consumed by end users and that service providers can count on when deploying a new technology. We talked about how basically every modern device, every modern browser supports FIDO authentication. And as we move into the realm of connected devices, we're also making inroads there through support for IoT, FIDO authentication IoT as well, as we look beyond just user authentication into device authentication. So critical to have the technology built into devices at scale, and we're doing quite well there. And lastly, it's important for a new technology to have strong regulatory and government embrace. And again, I think we've done quite well there for FIDO Alliance. So I've cited all sorts of government regulations, but really critical here is the fact that we actively engage with government bodies inside of FIDO Alliance as an organization, right? We have government members. We have a government deployment working group where government bodies come in and talk about their requirements, their use cases, and then collaborate to make sure that they can be addressed through FIDO specifications and our guidance outputs as well. So these are the key steps we need to take to become part of the web's DNA. We continue to focus on these and continue to make progress. And then once that's accomplished, our primary objective, of course, is to enable a phishing-resistant future. And here's what we need to do to get there. First, this might seem obvious, a statement, right? Replace password logins with biometrics and keys. But note, I say password logins, not passwords themselves, right? Because as Jeremy pointed out, it'll take some time to get rid of passwords. But we need to start with behavioral change. So, we did a UX study in 2021 and released some guidelines. And it was fascinating to see consumers' reactions to what ultimately is a more user-friendly solution, right? So using a biometric is much easier than trying to remember a complex password, but changing behavior isn't so easy. And so there's, these behavioral flows need to start now. The good news is that things like Touch ID, Face ID, and Android fingerprint and Windows Hello have proven that authentication technology can be consumerized. When Touch ID first came out, a lot of people questioned its utility, but suddenly they saw the convenience of using Touch ID to unlock their phone. And soon that action they took to unlock their phone allowed them to download an app and access that app. And then soon after that, it allowed them to log into websites and authorize transactions. All right, so it's been proven that a biometric, a single gesture login action can work. And I think that behavior is going to be critical as on the back end, we work to actually replace passwords with FIDO key pairs. A second key step, and this is a big one, is to stop depending on knowledge-based factors for account creation. So FIDO is doing some really important work. In fact, perhaps our most important work to standardize identity verification flows. And Ray Rivera will talk about the certification aspects of this shortly. But ultimately, we need to stop relying on knowledge-based factors for account creation, as that is also what will be the fallback for account recovery. And as long as there's knowledge-based proofs for account recovery, there's a wide open backdoor for hackers to walk through and take over accounts. So we really want to match our commitment to possession-based authentication with a commitment to possession-based identity proofing and verification. And then at that point, we're really in position to replace passwords with FIDO key pairs. In fact, the second step isn't a necessary step, but it'll certainly help a lot. But that's where we want to get to. All right. So when an account is created, there's not a knowledge-based factor to create the account. There's not a knowledge-based factor to secure the account. And when it comes time to recover the account, again, there's an inherence factor or something about the individual that allows them to safely recover that account without relying on shared secrets. Additionally, earlier or last year, Apple talked at their Worldwide Developer Conference, introduced the concept of something called pass keys, which basically promises to sync FIDO key pairs across iCloud, similar to how iCloud Keychain secures passwords today. So promising to offer a password manager-like experience, but instead of having passwords on a server, you have FIDO key pairs, public keys on the server, private keys on the device. And so I think that sort of innovation, that sort of commitment will rapidly lead to protecting not just workers in the enterprise, but also consumers at scale. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for your time today. I know I'm just about at time, but Jeremy, I'd be happy to take any questions that we have time to handle. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Andrew. Yeah, I think the one question that came up from somebody with this was some confusion around, is a passwordless solution with FIDO, not single factor. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how FIDO is deployed only to support multi-factor in these use cases.
Yeah, so FIDO inherently is a multi-factor authentication flow, right? So you have you're in possession of your device and you're proving that you're verifying yourself to the device as well. If you're using a biometric, if you're using a security key, again, it's possession and adherence. And so I think FIDO fundamentally is a multi-factor. It meets MFA requirements through a single gesture. And in fact, if you cross the pond over to Europe, as we look at a lot of the SCA requirements from PSC2, we feel like FIDO again, uniquely addresses that, through a simple gesture rather than depending on an OTP code as a second factor.
Great, thanks. I know there are a couple other questions in the queue, but I think as they came in, you addressed some of them. More to the point, we want to keep things moving and on time. So let me say, Andrew, thanks. Really appreciate you taking the time to come talk to us today. And from here, we're going to shift right into a panel that I think is going to build a lot on what both Eric and Andrew had to talk about, a panel on how government and industry are rethinking authentication. So 20 years ago, authentication meant a password. 10 years ago, it was a smart card or a one-time passcode token, but things are really changing quite a bit these days, as we've heard. So to moderate this panel, I am pleased to introduce my venerable colleague, Grant Schneider, who will be popping on in just a moment, and also introduce our other panelists, Grant and Pam and Christine. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeremy. Really appreciate it. It's been a great event, and if we can go ahead and get the other panelists to turn their videos on, we'll get started. I want to thank the Better Identity Coalition and FIDO and Identity Theft Resource Center for hosting us. This really has been a great, I guess, almost day and a half now. I do think we're going to build on some of the themes that you've already heard, and we'll probably double down on a couple of them as well. But I want to introduce our panelists that we've got here today. I'm really honored and excited to be here with them. First of all, we have Grant Dasher. Grant is leading identity and access management issues at CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. I think everyone knows that acronym. Previously, Grant worked at Google, where he was a principal software engineering director focused on authentication, identity, and security for Google Cloud. Grant also worked in the U.S. Digital Services during the Obama administration, supporting immigration benefit processing at USCIS, among a number of other projects. So Grant, thank you for being with us here today. Secondly, we have Pam Dingle. Pam is the Director of Identity Standards at Microsoft. Pam has 15 years of experience in implementation and architecture of identity standards for web access management and provisioning and federation. As the Director of Identity Standards at Microsoft, Pam leads a team of experts dedicated to collaboration within the industry to imagine, author, and drive adoption of identity standards, including single sign-on, API security, next-generation credentials, authentication, and blockchain, pretty much everything. So we're thrilled to have Pam here with us. And then Christine Owen. Christine is the Director of Advanced Solutions for Cybersecurity at Guidehouse. Christine is a self-proclaimed recovering attorney, which I take differently now that I work at a law firm, but a self-proclaimed recovering attorney who found solace in identity and access management consulting. She's focused on securing people, things, applications, devices in the cloud through better identity and better identity management. Christine does a lot of work inside the federal space. And in my opinion, she's really the heart and soul of federal identity management. And at some point, we'll be able to have happy hours again, and everyone can come and see that demonstrated. So without further ado, would love to jump into some questions. Grant, I want to start with you. And I think Jeremy asked me to moderate this because he really liked the idea of having 3 grants in one sphere all at once, because that's relatively rare. But I want to pick up on what Andrew just talked about. The Biden administration put out specific guidance around the implementation of non-phishable MFA, and CISA recently highlighted FIDO as the gold standard. What is driving, in your mind, this apparently renewed focus on identity, and what type of feedback? What are you hearing from agencies?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question, Grant. And no, I always appreciate being on panels with multiple grants. I don't do it very often. Yeah, so it's really great to be here and speak to you all. I think that, to answer the question, I think we've known for a while that identity is the source of a large number of breaches, and in particular, phishing in particular. There's been a lot of research by my former employer and others that have sort of demonstrated that it's a very common vector by which people compromise networks. And I think that really, with the shift that's been going on in the industry, that's been sort of hypercharged by the pandemic, where people are moving, to more remote work posture, introduction of cloud, introduction of mobile, all of these factors, the traditional, network-centric security architecture has had so many holes punched in it to support what people need to do for successfully executing their missions, that it's really sort of become untenable. And so there's been a move towards a different security architecture, which has identity at the core to defend against, those environments. And I think that when you move into that world, you really need to focus on issues around authentication and phishing in particular, since it's sort of a foundational piece if you want to build your security architecture around that. And I think in terms of agencies, look, agencies are organizations. They are, in many cases, they range from, tiny agencies that are very similar to small businesses to large enterprises that are, in some cases like the DoD, larger than any real private sector entities. And they have the same problems, right? In terms of their workers, needing to be remote, operating from different environments, incorporation of cloud technologies, all of these problems, and agencies are really trying to grapple with how to make this transition. Now, interestingly, the government has been invested in phishing-resistant authentication for a really long time with the PIV program, and one of the largest deployments of PKI at scale that's out there. But the interoperability with the broader market is critical in order to be efficient at spending taxpayer dollars and so on. And so I think the government is really interested in exploring the evolution of other technologies like FIDO in the authentication space that are being adopted in the broader community. And agencies are doing the same, right? There are places where PIV cards don't work. They need to explore other technologies that provide comparable security in order to authenticate their employees and partners.
Now, thanks, Grant. That's really helpful. And you noted that, and this is something I've thought. There's no one size fits all for government or for industry, right? Organizations are individual, but government has generally led in a lot of ways on multi-factor. But then government's kind of hard to shift and hard to change gears. Pam, I guess, what are you seeing with commercial organizations from multi-factor? They typically get to be or demonstrate a little more agility, I think we consider, than a lot of government organizations, but in a lot of ways have been later to embrace MFA. But what are you seeing as you work with organizations in the commercial space?
So we're seeing strong adoption right now, very strong adoption. However, strong adoption still doesn't mean 100% adoption. It means, I think the number that I have most recently is 32%. If you look at our platform, and that may or may not be representative of the industry, I suspect it is. So, from a commercial perspective, what we're seeing is folks focus on flexibility and focus on combining multiple factors. And by that, I mean multiple form factors. So rather than trying to put all their eggs in one basket of one type of thing, they tend to be trying to create a suite of factors that will give them, account recovery, that will give them, just ways to fail gracefully, but also ways to handle non-standard workers. So, so we're really seeing, I would say, right now, creativity about solving their problems. We're seeing, a lot of interest in NIST 800-63, not only in the US, but worldwide, because it is sort of a gold standard for how you can calculate the risk that comes from authentication. And then the other thing that people are doing is they're not just looking at that one gate, they're actually building into their entire regime. So the buzzwords, if you want to talk about the identity buzzwords, we're talking about adaptive access, right? The ability to actually do threat detection, look at the risk associated to the user, right? And not simply believe that if they can pass one, jump through one hoop, that now they're trusted to the end of days, until they have to be forgotten and asked again.
No, that's and I want to come back to the contextual piece that you were getting at in a little bit, but the 32% is surprising, and I guess, do you have any thoughts, and maybe it's just a guess as to what are the inhibitors? I mean, is it just behaviorally, people don't want to change how they're working? I mean, certainly the threat is widely understood. Most multi-factor implementations are easier, in fact, to use than remembering all the passwords, as Andrew just talked about, to a large degree. So what are you seeing as the barrier to raising that number?
So I think there's two types of organizations. There are the organizations who are big enough and who have sort of the security apparatus to understand that they should be using MFA, but they have organizational barriers. So a lot of our customers come to us and say, they're sort of agonized, right? They know they need to do it, right? But they have legacy technology, or they have other reasons why they can't adopt. And to them, I have so much sympathy, and I'm really sorry. For everyone else, though, it's really, I believe, it's on people's lists, right? It's there. But the adoption, we are seeing strong adoption right now. And part of it is because of the supply chain risk. So what's happening right now is that, the attacks are targeting not the big guys or the big entities, but the small ones. And so, the folks that we're seeing adopt right now in a big hurry are the ones in a supply chain ecosystem who are seeing, the company beside them fall. And so, so that's the other piece we're seeing. We're seeing hurried adoption by people who suddenly recognize risk. We're seeing, troubled. We're seeing people really try to push forward past their barriers. And then there's just this big pool of folks who don't know, or who just simply haven't seen, they haven't got to it on their lists yet.
I'd like to add a couple other challenges the organizations would have to getting to full multi-factor adoption, like ubiquitous throughout their system. I think one of those is really mobile devices, because if you lock down an application to only accept multi-factor and you can't achieve that on the phone, then you can't have people be as mobile as they are today. So that like whoever is out there working on mobility and getting multi-factor on the phones, please start going faster for us, because I think that would be super helpful. That's one problem. I know that the federal government's working on that because there's a lot of push on derived PIV, and that's something that we've been working on with some of our clients in the federal government. So that is one way to fix that. But then once you get that, we also have to have the end user application to actually accept that derived PIV. So then it gets really messy, and then the question is like, is this really an AL2 or AL3? Because is it single factor or multi-factor? Because you have to add a PIN. Anyway, that's one factor of that. But the other one would be service accounts and other RPA accounts. And adding multi-factor to them is not always as easy as it seems either. I know a lot of organizations use PAM solutions to be able to protect those accounts. But again, you also have to have your target applications be able to interact with that PAM solution to be able to get that protection. And then again, that's the same question, is that really multi-factor, or is it just a really long SSH key? So does it violate or does it not? So it's questions like that I think is really hard for organizations to be able to get to that 100% multi-factor solution.
Yeah, thanks, Christine. That certainly makes sense and is helpful. And I want to ask you about something else that Pam mentioned, and she talked about it being on people's lists. And federal agencies have long lists of to-dos. There was an executive order a year ago. Eric alluded to it this morning that had a whole bunch of to-dos. He also is getting ready to very soon, bold and italicized, I think the way he put it, put out a zero trust strategy, which is undoubtedly going to add to agencies' list of to-dos. How are you seeing agencies prioritize identity? Like, is it making it to the top of their lists, or is it just an item on the list because the lists are getting so long?
I would say it's an item on the list because the list is so long. And I don't think that is saying that identity isn't important to agencies. It absolutely is. It's been something that's been important for, I want to say, since the beginning of time, but that's not true. But since the PIV program started, I think it's been important. It's been a FISMA question for a gazillion years. I feel like, at first the question is, are you issuing PIV? The answer was no for a really long time. When that was, Grant, it made me sad. And then it moved over to, are you actually using PIV? And now it's saying, are your systems actually using PIV? So we're like migrating to figure out where that hole is for PIV usage, or just multi-factor in general, because really we switched to the question of AAL3. But the point here is that it's absolutely a part of that long priority of lists. Obviously, it's high up right now because there is a requirement for MFA by the middle of March, as is the same for encryption of data at rest and in transit. There's a mid-March date for that as well. So those are the things that I think agencies are working on furiously, but then there's been a lot of bumps in the road. We still don't have a budget passed by Congress for agencies. Getting cybersecurity people onboarded into federal agencies sometimes is like pulling teeth, because you have to first find them and then you have to wait what seems like 100 years to get them onboarded. And then the last thing I think that's really important is that we also have a lot of additional directives and BODs coming out from CISA and OMB that are equally as important as all these other things, right? Like Log4j, super important. So everyone had to kind of drop everything, fix that, and then move forward. And I think that that's going to continue on. So it makes progress take longer, I think.
Yeah, you hit on a whole bunch of issues there. And I mean, some around just like compliance, right? Are we asking the right PIV questions to really drive this security piece? But I want to hit, and Grant, maybe ask you a little on the prioritization piece. And to Christine's point, all of these issues are important, and we need to do all of them at once, but agencies can't. They're just not going to be able to. Is CISA looking at, or working with OMB and others, how to help agencies prioritize? And one agency's priority may end up necessarily being different than another agency's, just because where they're at from a starting standpoint. But how are you seeing agencies, and are you guys able to help them with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is yes. We are at multiple levels. We have a whole part of CISA that's responsible with working with agencies at the line level to try and get to strategies for each agency to execute different parts of this. So some pieces of that, like the CDM program, have been going on forever, but there are other efforts within CISA to do that kind of tactical work. At the same time, though, we're trying to make some sort of more strategic investments in terms of shared services and other things like that, especially for some of these small agencies, will provide a sort of a template. You want a pre sort of configured DNS solution, or perhaps email solution, things of this nature that will allow sort of step improvements for some of these smaller agencies in their cybersecurity capabilities. In terms of prioritizing the work, I think that it's a tough balance, but I spend a lot of time talking to Eric and Krista Russia up at OMB about how to balance between sort of incremental improvements and really driving towards a zero trust architecture, which has a core identity foundation. And I think that's really critical. Is oftentimes we're sort of racing, trying to do as much as we can in a short period of time, but some of these transitions require really sort of figuring out, okay, how do we get to an architecture that fundamentally changes the security properties of the environment, And so I think there's a balance there. I think that there is a sort of work on both sides of that, to be seen how successful we are. But I certainly think that, I think others at CISA repeatedly say that identity is the foundation of a zero trust architecture, and the president's executive order has committed the government on both the civilian and recently on the NSS side, national security system side, to go in that direction. So I certainly think, identity is high up there in the priority list. As Christine said, a big problem is just a lack of capacity, right? We just need more cybersecurity people in the government working on these issues at all levels. We've said that repeatedly as CISA. There's some new hiring authorities that are hopefully going to help with that. We'll see how that all plays out. But yeah, I mean, it's a difficult question.
Yeah, and one other item that, and completely agree, and I think a challenge, and Christine mentioned this, is we're under a continuing resolution, and in fact, there's been no new, and even the 22 budget that we're hoping to get was well baked before the cybersecurity executive order came out, and well before Log4j and a lot of the other things took place. And so even once we get that budget, which presumably is going to have hopefully we will get it, and it'll have some additional funding for CISA and others in this space, but that still is kind of behind the needs that we have. So to our friends in Congress who are watching and tuning in, please help get that done, because it's going to be really important. Pam, I want to talk a little bit about more on the move towards passwordless. Do we get to kill the password? Are organizations thinking about that? But I want to also add in, we got a question from the audience around, are we thinking about identity for inclusion and accessibility for others, for everyone, as we're thinking about solutions? So not just what's the most secure solution, but what's going to be inclusive, and is killing the password kind of part of that? So I threw a couple of things together at you. Apologies.
No, it's good. So yeah, we're very aware of the inclusion and accessibility pieces. I mean, part of what it means to have a flexible multi-factor regime is to not force somebody to use a form factor that just can't work. So there are, and of course there are many types of inclusiveness and many types of accessibility. So that's the other thing. You don't just get to check mark one thing and say, this is our accessible option. You need to look at, you need to be able to handle people who have lost a finger. You need to be able to handle people who have low visibility. But you also need to handle things that are much, that aren't sort of the easy poster child examples as well. So, that's a piece that is less, though, part of the standards and more part of the implementation, and a piece that I think individual companies get to show a lot of leadership on, right? What they do, when they do it. There's also very simple things like how integrated is your authentication regime into your computer, right? So when you think about localization, right? Are the hoops that you're expecting your users to jump through localized? I mean, there's just a lot of things that, we have a huge opportunity right now, because our authentication is becoming more and more built in to what we do. It means that some of these operating system level activities can, the operating systems are designed for the globe, right? And so it changes the work that vendors have to do to make sure that they can help people. So I know it's a general answer, but we are absolutely thinking about it. And I'm trying to not reference any particular work from any particular vendor as well, because I know that you would all prefer that. But as far as passwordless goes, this is a really interesting question, right? You have to plan for the future. We absolutely want to kill passwords, but the most important thing right now is not killing passwords. The most important thing right now is removing fraud. And that is a different thing. Like, killing passwords is a philosophical, happy feeling, of a job well done. But ultimately, if you use passwords, but you use another factor on top, if you have to layer your factors together, you're doing something more important than merely killing the password. And so, I really want to make sure people understand. And not only that, even 100% multi-factor in your organization is not the goal that makes sense for anyone who isn't an organization with the 10-year plan, right? If you've got a 2-year goal, then protect your admins, right? So, if we want to talk about catchy slogans that are really not very catchy, right? Protect your admins, MFA your admins, right? If you could do only that, and if that's all you have the money or the time or the resources to do, for the love of Pete, please protect your admins.
No, that's great, Pam. And I also want to ask you, and you started to talk about this earlier, and we talked about it last week when we did our prep call, the whole idea about contextual authentication and the fact that, traditionally we check identity once, we grant access, and then at some point, the token gets revoked. And when you log off, when you walk away, go to lunch for too long, at some point, your access is pulled away. But what are you seeing, and where do you think the future is going to be around more resilient and reactive and insightful ways to think about access?
Yeah, I mean, identity and security are just becoming closer and closer. That is the future of identity, is we sort of in some ways remove the silos that have been artificially created between those two entities. But what we're seeing right now that's important, is all of the background checks, all of the context that we're looking at, all of the, breached password databases, right? So these systems are checking live a whole bunch of factors that are passive factors, right? So not just the hoops you jump through, but, are you an outlier? Is your user overprivileged? That's one of the newer and more fancy ones, right? Is what you're doing consistent with what you did last week? Can you, has your name shown up in a breach in the last little while, right? All of these factors are now combining.
Isn't the answer always yes to that?
Well, possibly, but you only have to act on that. In theory, you only act on it when it happens originally, right? But that so that idea, when I talked about adaptive access before, there's two pieces. You have to be able to detect that something's wrong, but then you have to be able to act. And that's the other piece that's really in the future right now. We are trying to react in as close to real time as we can. So for example, there's a thing called continuous access evaluation, right? So we're not going to give you a whole bunch of tokens and cookies, right? And let you have them for a day. And if you get, if something happens an hour in, you still have them for the day. We're trying to work as an industry, and it's really hard. We've defended on cookies for a long time, right? We're trying to get to the point where we can claw that access back. No matter where you are, no matter what device you're on, we can't, your access stops and you're asked to re-authenticate, you're asked to reset your password, whatever action is next. So that's really, I shudder to say the future because we're working on it now, but it's a very long tail goal.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a little bit on that point. I think it's really critical. I've never really understood some of the reasons why the industry has sort of evolved in the way it has, between the sort of segregation of the identity community and the security community and things of this nature. And also, all the focus on primary authentication, as an event, and then somehow magically you're in good shape. But we've seen, with real actors in the wild, real actors aren't confined by the way in which we've sort of organized our own problems conceptually. And so, for example, we've seen this for decades in Windows with, sort of golden ticket kinds of Kerberos attacks that are compromising, internal credentials that are post-authentication tokens. We've seen it more recently with, or at the same time, really, in the space of SAML, cookie theft, golden SAML attacks, bearer token compromises, replay, all of this, right? All of these techniques that people use compromise different portions of the authentication after the primary sign-in event. And it's a real critical piece of the overall puzzle. And so I think that this effort, I think in some people's head, there was this magic notion that, oh, we have a credential, our PIV card, and now we just can do mutual TLS every time for every transaction. Our computers aren't that fast. The smart cards aren't that fast. It just doesn't work, right? That's not actually what anyone does. They do a single primary authentication event, and then they have, derivative credentials. And so I think as an engineering problem, figuring out how to do this continuously, to continually analyze the sessions, to invalidate them, to leverage, other, risk signals, other kinds of things. Machine learning, people like to talk about. It's always been a bit of a holy grail, and some people might call it a white whale. But I think in general, this notion of not treating like sign in as a discrete event that you can put in a bucket and then be done with it, and just assume you have a magic token that solves all the rest of your problems. I think that's a critical observation that the industry is moving towards in many sort of different ways as it does. And I just really want to echo all the things that Pam said.
So this is like literally my favorite subject. I'm so sorry, Grant, but I really have to jump in on this one because like contextual authentication is my favorite subject right now. And the one thing that I think is really critical on this is that there's not one product that can actually do contextual authentication by itself. It's impossible. You have to have multiple products integrated together, and then one of the products acts as the decision maker to determine essentially authentication and access control, and then also access revocation if necessary. And so to be able to do that, like the way I visualize this as like the centralized broker thing. And so you have lots of different endpoints that's talking back to that broker. So you obviously have your IDP that we're using, phishing resistant MFA, to get a user in if we can live in the idealistic world, which I love to live in. So that's going in there. And then we have some sort of cert or identifier on a device that feeds in and says, here's the device. And then on top of that, we have user past history, we have the user IP address, we have the user device health, and we have all the things that we can get, all of the information we can get, which we can do now because we have such great advancements in AI, plus great advancements in a lot of the products that we have. So then we add that together, and then we do that continuous evaluation that Pam was talking about. So I think it's really awesome, like where we are today, because I remember back in the day when we were talking through, like when we were reading ABAC stuff, and that's what we've been talking about for like decades, about what we're trying to get to, and we're finally closer and closer to there, and it's so exciting. So sorry.
No, that's great. That's great. This is a great conversation, and exactly what we need to be thinking about. Pam, one question I wanted to ask you is, you've done a lot of work internationally and with standards bodies. How are you seeing the international community approach kind of all these subjects, but are you seeing us head towards some common ground, or are vendors going to need to deal with just a whole bunch of different regimes and a whole bunch of different directives globally?
So the industry is definitely coming together. There's a whole bunch of standards that are meant to do basically the things that Christine was talking about. So an example of this would be the Shared Signals and Events Working Group at OpenID Foundation. So they're working on the idea of basically sending those lightweight signals that could unite all the different products. And yeah, it can't be any single vendor. It has to be standardized. It has to be something that the vendors can write to the standard so that we can scale it, because otherwise you end up with holes in your architecture. So the OpenID Foundation is focusing on it heavily. There's also a piece called Demonstration of Proof of Possession, DPOP, which none of you should ever have to know about. But what demonstration of proof of possession is all about is letting if you hand a token to an API because you want to get data back, it's the way that the API can actually validate that that the entity passing the token is the entity that was issued the token. So addressing token theft is yet another leg on this stool, right? Of really getting to secure sessions and to being able to revoke data when necessary. So they're working together. We have a long way to go. And part of this is just that not everyone sees the importance of it yet, but we will. We have it already. And the other thing is, none of you out there should have to care about this stuff. This should be the stuff that you ask for on an RFP. And then we, as vendors, all panic about and run off and try and get. At least that's the idea.
So I want to turn to a question from the audience that actually is kind of to that point. It's in the user's domain, and that's around password managers. And the question is, what is there value for password managers, and particularly, what are the risks or concerns if the device that you're running them on has been compromised in some way, shape, or form? Grant, do you want to jump in or?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think this is a bit of a nuanced question. I think, CISA has said publicly, and I agree, that on net, for most people, password managers are a useful transitional technology. And I certainly try and use one, for managing my passwords. I think there's a lot of details, right? So there's a lot of, fly-by-night kind of password vendors, manager vendors that store all your passwords in the cloud and sort of expose you to certain kinds of risks by doing that. Some of them leverage end-to-end encryption, others don't. There's all sorts of details there, but I think, if you use a password manager that's built into a major browser, whether, Chrome or Edge or something like that, Safari, iCloud, you're in decent shape. And I think CISA would recommend that the vast majority of people do that for accounts that have passwords. I think in terms of compromising of the machine, look, you get into complicated questions about what kind of adversaries you're trying to defend against, what's your threat model. I'll just leave you to note that if your machine is compromised with malware, whether your password is lost or not doesn't really matter, because, for example, someone can swipe your cookies and have their malware just sort of act as your computer and access all of your data. And so, yeah.
No, I remember I was over at OPM right after the OPM breach, and I got asked, by people, oh, was the data encrypted? And it was kind of the nature of that. I don't know that it would have mattered because of where the keys would have been, and that type of an instance. Pam or Christine, anything to add there?
I use a password manager. I couldn't survive without my password manager. I think for most people, managing passwords most of the time, a password management, some kind of regime for password management is absolutely critical, and that the benefits outweigh the risks by a lot. The other thing is that, whatever you do, you need to not reuse passwords. This is the number one thing. Like, there's a whole entire attack called password spray, where all they do is they calculate the psychology of human beings and figure out what password, given the password policy that someone has set, right? Like, you have to change it quarterly, and it has to have punctuation. There's a whole thing where they just say, okay, well, human beings are most likely to say it's, let's see, quarterly. Okay, spring, because I can do that 4 times a year, right? 2022, because that's going to be unique because it's a new year. Exclamation mark. Oh, and I have to capitalize the front. So if you have a password of spring 2022 or 2021, exclamation right now, you're like in 1%. 1% of any given population will set that exact password. So all they do is they look for those types of passwords. So anything that's unique, anything that's not reused is a million times better than something you've reused.
Computers are much better at managing random shared secrets than humans are. And so, yeah.
No, absolutely the case. I want to ask each of you, like, what should organizations be doing today? Like, I mean, organizations are all on an evolution, right? And they're on an evolution towards greater security, and many of them are on a journey towards zero trust. So what are things that, and they're going to live in multiple environments for a while, right? There is no, I just get to leapfrog into the future, unfortunately, from a technology standpoint. I bring all my baggage, if you will, or legacy with me. But what recommendations do you have to organizations? What should they be thinking about to do? What steps can they take now that are going to be somewhat future-proof and also be investments in the future? And Christine, can I start with you?
So this is another one of my really favorite topics. One, I think the others will probably, hopefully touch upon other parts. So the one thing that I think is really important is once you create that plan, once you do the market research, pick the vendors that you want to be able to move, migrate security architectures to zero trust. I assume that's what you want to do, right? Do the micro-segmentation. The one thing that you have to put into your entire plan is a lot of testing. A lot of testing. So when we move from this, lateral movement security architecture to a micro segmented security architecture, we are literally breaking our systems and then we're rebuilding it. And so when we do that, we actually find that things break. So things that were created for a lateral movement within a system, a great example of that is remoting into someone's computer, having the help desk remote into someone's computer. That's super easy. In the traditional security architecture sense, that actually becomes much harder in the zero trust architectural posture. And the reason is because that's the whole point, right? We want that lateral movement to be super hard. So it breaks. So then what do you have to do? Well, you find a breakage. You have to go figure out how to fix that breakage, find out what the right tool is, figure that out, and then move forward. So this is like, honestly, the testing portion is going to take you a much longer time than you expect as an organization. And it's something that absolutely has to be done so that you can build that system right the first or second time, maybe the second or third, but it's the way to do it, in my opinion. And it's going to take you a lot of time. For the federal government, it's a completely different way to buy products. It's not something that they're used to doing. They're not used to having, year-long testing and like figuring it out and bringing in more products. But it's a completely different paradigm and something that needs to get done. And then also Congress, how do we fund that? I don't know.
I think that's going to be unsatisfactory to leadership that just wants it done tomorrow, Christine.
I know. I'm sorry to Eric.
Grant, anything to add on to that, or Pam?
Yeah, no, I mean, look, I think, the thing that CISA is telling agencies in this context is, look, get caught trying, yes, make progress, pick, a population of applications that is narrow enough to actually make progress, that is simple enough to have realistic constraints that are tractable, but make sure you do this in a way that can grow over time, right? We don't want to just bolt more product into the technology. And so balancing that, architecture and progress making is tricky and context dependent, but I think it's critical. In terms of foundational things, I mean, look, no one is going to do wrong by making sure that they have a scalable, phishing resistant multi-factor authenticator deployment for all of their populations of users, right? Starting with their admins and then expanding from there into the employees and then the mission partners, and getting to the more complicated use cases. That is a significant value add in its own, and it's a foundational piece of zero trust. So I think it's one of our proposed plays to agencies is to really sort of focus just on that question of, hey, do you have phishing resistant authenticator coverage for all of your relevant populations, especially your admins? Because there are, to this day, and we can get into the reasons, but there are all sorts of little complicated reasons why, sometimes admins are harder to do this to than, regular users, but they're more important, as Pam said earlier.
So I think it's very clear from this that the thing you should do is listen to Christine, like from now on, like she needs like a weekly podcast or something like that. Everything, the reason why Christine is so right about the testing is that it's not just the jumping the hoop, right? It's all the things that wrap it. It's making sure that, that it's an easy experience. It's making sure that you can recover against failure. It's making sure it works with all your different machines and all your different environments, right? We are working really hard to make it easier, but it's not perfectly easy. However, you have to protect, get to MFA, protect your admins, do that first, and then, learn from the process.
Well, and I think there really is, I'm hearing a message. I mean, this is a bit of a journey, and the ability to to ensure that organizations understand that organizations, C-suites, secretaries, deputy secretaries, et cetera, understand that there are no silver bullets is really helpful, and the user base as well, that there are things that seem like a frustration to them, but are actually a feature, and are there to help them and protect them moving forward. So one last, we did get a question, and Grant, I don't know if you're able to talk about the zero trust maturity model at CISA, whether it's going to be updated or anything new is coming, but we'll let you end on that and then get it back to Jeremy Grant for the break.
Yeah, so CISA released a draft ZTMM last year. It will be updated. There's a lot of guidance documents in this space that CISA has been working with other agencies on. And just in terms of prioritization, this one has not yet gone through the pipe, but yes, it is our intention to update that document, and finalize it.
It's some of that's tied to your recruiting and hiring, so you can get more of those documents out to the world. Well, thank you all very much. Really greatly appreciate you taking the time to be with us today, and all the insights and knowledge that you've provided to the audience. So thank you very much. And Jeremy, back to you.
Great, thank you. From one grant to two other grants, and also Pam and Christine, I really appreciate you all taking time today. This was a great panel. Glad we could get you here for a few minutes. We're going to take a 15-minute break now. If you want to get a bite to eat, stretch your legs, just get away from the screen. I don't know about you, I always get Zoom overload. We'll come back at 1 o'clock Eastern time with a panel focusing, shifting really from authentication to identity proofing, and looking at next-gen ID proofing, attacks and protections in AI. Oh my. So we'll see you in 15 minutes. Thanks. All right, welcome back, everybody. Hope you managed to have a good break. We had some interesting discussions about felt like I was in a chill room at a 90s rave with some of the music selection, which was good. Is what I needed to decompress before this next panel. I'm excited where we're going with this one. This is going to be next-gen ID proofing, attacks and protections in AI, oh my. So let me set the stage a little bit. The pandemic accelerated attacks on ID proofing tools, given that so many transactions were forced online and a lot of fraud attempts followed. I think what we're seeing is adversaries are getting more sophisticated against some of the legacy tools we've had, but security practitioners are as well. In many cases, they're using artificial intelligence to more effectively detect and block attacks. Now, AI offers great benefits, but its use has also raised some policy concerns around potential bias and accuracy issues. So this is a panel, and I'll ask everybody to turn on their cameras now and their microphones to come online. We want to try and take a look at a whole bunch of different facets around how AI is being used today, how companies in the space are taking proactive approaches to tackle potential bias and accuracy issues. Also discuss the role policymakers can play in ensuring that these types of tools are delivering maximum benefit and minimum risk. It's a lot of ground to cover over the next 45 minutes, so let's just jump in here. Pleased to welcome the following panelists. First, we've got Brighton Haslett, who's joining us from the House Financial Services Committee minority staff. She's their lead on their AI task force work and also on issues around diversity and equity and inclusion. Welcome, Brighton. Amy Shewart is head of U.S. government affairs for FIDO, a firm in the ID verification space. Dr. Ray Vera is the director of certification programs for the FIDO Alliance. We heard Andrew Shikiar, their executive director, in a keynote earlier today talking about some of the work they do in certification. Ray's the one who makes it all happen. And finally, Jordan Burris is the Senior Director of Product Market Strategy for the public sector at Socure. So let's jump into stuff. Amy, I wanted to ask you to tee things off. We heard a lot in yesterday's sessions focusing on some of the fraud around pandemic assistance, about how easy it's been for some criminals to get past legacy digital ID verification tools. And FIDO recently put out a fraud report that detailed just how some of these attacks are getting more sophisticated against remote identity proofing verification solutions. What are some of the takeaways from that report? How are these attacks evolving?
Thanks, Jeremy, for having me today. FIDO, as you know, is a founding member of the Better Identity Coalition and a board member of the FIDO Alliance. So we always look forward to this event each year. As you mentioned, FIDO releases an annual fraud report talking about what we see from our clients over the past year and things we learned. It's not a surprise to anyone that as the pandemic continued, more and more folks are doing things online. And with that, we have some really interesting trends that started to pop up. The average identity fraud rate has really increased by about 44% since 2019. So we know that identity theft and identity fraud are really continuing to be hot topics, as we heard from the Identity Theft Resource Center yesterday. This work is really driven by opportunistic fraudsters that no longer work a 9 to 5. They're working around the clock to stop, to try to steal different types of services. One of the things that's interesting is we're seeing what we categorize more as medium sophistication fraud. So this is fraud that is with less obvious errors. So it could be something as simple as a font that is slightly different. Is it, Arial italicized versus Arial, or some other little small minute change to a document to try to get past systems? The other thing that's really interesting about this is they are also trying to imitate security features. And overall, we're seeing a 55% increase from last year. The other thing that we're seeing in terms of a trend with document fraud and specifically is with our clients, passports are actually the document that we're seeing the most fraud. Our experts believe that that's because the passport is a one-sided document, not a two, and because it's a high assurance document. A passport is going to be the key to get a lot of different services. So if a fraudster can pass our system or another system with a passport, it gives them a lot more access. And so it's something that they're really targeting.
Interesting. Thanks. Appreciate the summary, although frightening to see how some of these things are evolving. Let me ask a follow-up, and Emily, actually ask both you and Jordan to weigh in here, and I'll let Jordan lead off first. Both of you are in firms that are using artificial intelligence to detect and block these attacks. What can you tell me about how AI is starting to play a role here, and how does it differ from some other technologies that you might use in your security stack?
Thanks, Jeremy, and appreciate being here to talk about this important topic. What I would say is that when you look at the usage of AI, it is really just an enabler for everything that you would like to do within your organization. Far too often when we're talking about security or what is being done to manage fraud, there's a question about how much friction that you choose to introduce for applicants as part of the process overall. And often a lot of the legacy approaches that are taken today try to treat this as a toll gate, if you will. You must pass each gate, you must be perfect. And if you are perfect, you can get through the process. And this creates a whole host of issues as we relates to equity and inclusion, which I know we'll talk more later on in the discussion. But and often as you're hearing this conversation and just that assumption that everyone is bad, it doesn't have to be the case, right? It is possible to manage an inclusive user experience that is seamless and do so in a way that protects security and helps to mitigate fraud. But what it takes is taking a different approach to what has just been done historically. And a lot of this goes into managing around a greater amount of maturity in the way in which we deal with identity transactions, right? For us, identity is dynamic, and the use cases associated with it mean a more measured and risk-based approach is necessary, where you are not going and taking an individual through those phase gates, and instead you're building a holistic view where such that when they run into issues in their environment, say you're talking passports were just being discussed, right? You haven't changed. You just got married and you had to change your name. Well, now you need a new passport issued, or you've recently moved, and as such, information that historically has been on your address is all changed, et cetera. Like these are all gates that in aggregate can lead to a lot of friction for the end user. Now, how do we do that? Like, how do we try to address this? Again, it takes a measure of managing those active and passive signals for an individual user, and such that you can help make probabilistic determinations about changes to their identity profile and the dynamic nature of the identity overall, in order to help get them through the process in a more automated fashion. And just to quickly wrap up with an example, because Jeremy knows I love those when it comes to having these conversations. Let's take a look at Puerto Rico, right? It is not uncommon to have multiple addresses with the same street name, same house number, and the same zip code. Even some rural areas in Puerto Rico don't even have formal addresses for housing units, right? And this is widely available through the Census Bureau. With algorithms and the usage of AI and certain patterns and models that can be pulled together, we're actually able to find better fit for these addresses first, and then work as an ensemble to generalize for all addresses, such that we're better able to identify how these addresses map up to an identity in particular, and then help inform the decision making that ultimately takes place when it comes to granting access to resources.
Thanks. Amy, you can give some examples of how you guys are using AI and machine learning.
Yeah, absolutely. So our biometric checks really have two core elements to them. A face matching. Does the person, their selfie or their video match the document that they are producing? And are they actually there? So with what we're seeing with fraudsters, spoofing's a real risk here for businesses. And so it's not just 2D masks. It's not just 3D masks these days. It's also, trying to get a video of trying to determine, is that actually Amy on the video chat, or did she record this and anticipate exactly what Jordan was about to say there? Probably not in this situation, but something that, we all need to deal with when working on these sort of things. So AI is a huge part of the toolkit here for companies like Onfido as we're trying to look at these things, because it allows us to scan faces. Everyone, I don't look like my driver's license photo exactly, since it was taken a few years back. And so we have to be able to be sure that my face matches that document, even though I've aged. We also have to be able to tell, are those security features and those slight deviations in a document, are those actually the authentic document, or has it been tampered with? So those are places where we use AI. And I think one of the real challenges is we're having a policy conversation these days about the use of AI technology, is that AI can do this in a way that humans just can't always do. We know that humans make mistakes, that there are going to be things that humans cannot spot, but AI can. And so I think fraud prevention is a really great use case for AI, and something that we really encourage the White House to take seriously as part of the Office of Science and Technology Policy's recent RFI.
Thanks. That's a good segue over to Brighton. Let me talk about some of the policy side of things. And I think we've established up front, AI's got a lot of great potential to improve security and other tools used in financial services. But we're also getting concerns from folks who are saying overly automated systems, if we don't understand how they're being designed, who's designing them, what they're going to do and not do, are we putting the machines in charge in a way that's actually going to potentially do harm? And are there some risks there? So how has the House Financial Services Committee been looking at this issue?
Yeah, so we've had several hearings on this issue in a couple of different subcommittees, including your testimony. Actually, in the AI task force, we've had hearings on digital ID as well as the ethics of AI. And then in the diversity and inclusion subcommittee, we've had several hearings on algorithmic bias. And in addition to that, on the Republican side, last April, I believe we released a fintech report covering a broad range of technology issues, but that included a section on algorithmic bias and the use of AI generally. So we're definitely paying close attention to these issues. I think as more and more of our systems throughout the financial sector become automated, that oversight will be really important. One of the key issues that we've looked at is explainability, or the idea that you should be able to explain how an algorithm makes decisions, particularly what inputs you're putting into an algorithm. And at one of our hearings, I thought it was really interesting. Our witness testified that algorithms themselves are not inherently biased or unbiased. They just analyze data, predict future outcomes, but bias can enter the system when developers tell the system which metric to optimize or to focus on most. So I think ideally we can design algorithms that make decisions more accurately and more fairly than those made by humans, but we have to focus on how the algorithms are built. I think the second piece that's really important is testing an algorithm's outputs to make sure that those decisions are both fair and accurate. So the fact that an algorithm contains bias doesn't mean it's broken or can't be fixed or should be abandoned. It just means that we've uncovered a flaw there, and we need to focus on how that flaw happened and how we can fix it so that doesn't happen in the future. So when we find that, I think we can approach those situations with a healthy amount of skepticism and concern, but see it as an opportunity to continue improving AI, learn how the bias got there, and then we can apply those lessons in further applications as well.
Thanks. And let me ask others in the panel to weigh in, Ray or Amy or Jordan, in terms of how are each of you looking at potential bias issues in some of these systems, at least as they apply to ID verification? What are some of the issues at play? How should we be thinking about them?
I mean, so Jeremy, I'm happy to get started from here. What I would say is it's important to look at kind of the overall system itself, and when we're really having a conversation around bias, AI is one element of it, but we have to kind of get to the ground truth and kind of the root, right? If we look at actually just a number of offerings that even exist today, a lot of those based on legacy approaches, they are all driven around, or they have bias incorporated in them, or things that make it harder for folks to engage in transactions, right? If we look at, heavily with identity verification today, credit data is used as a means and mechanism for helping to identify who someone is. There's over 45 million people, according to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, that are what is called credit invisible, which means that they have barely a credit file. They have no real information associated with that. What does that mean? That these folks will fall into the 20% that get locked out of the system and anything else that goes into it. So if you're building algorithms that make decisions based on credit data, you're effectively introducing what would be that problem or that bias into the apparatus overall. And it's important to recognize that and I think it was lovely put by Brighton, is that when you're building these models, it's important to understand kind of the what's going into the inputs, what's going into processing, what's going into the outputs overall, that we're doing rigorous testing around it. And one way we do it is we look to effectively challenge our models and to do critical analysis around the objectives of each one, confirming that it is still meeting the intent as it was determined. And if there isn't meeting the intent, like what can we change associated with that, and what can we change within the decision logic ultimately that allows us to get to a better outcome. So inherently, I wouldn't say AI as it exists is biased. It's more about being more mature in how we are managing the models themselves, and with that type of understanding and education, it's easier to build on models that can help us solve a number of challenges in the identity space.
So I think this is one of those areas where, FIDO also takes this really seriously and spends a lot of time retraining our models to improve their performance and further reduce bias. FIDO is actually headquartered in the United Kingdom. And so we worked with the UK's Information Commissioner's Office to participate in a regulatory sandbox to see what we could do to further address bias concerns in our model and what are ways and best practices to improve. And one of the things that was really nice about this exercise is it gave our folks an opportunity to really engage with experts, look at what we're doing, try some new things, see if there are ways to make improvements. We had some great results, but it also produced a report that's publicly available. And so that's something that we can share and we can point to as a place that we're really working on this.
Ray, I wanted to pivot over to you because I think that the testing and the certification side of things is something that we want to talk about today. And FIDO Alliance has launched a new initiative looking at testing and certifying products and remote ID proofing. Tell us more about the program and you sort of how it's set up and how it came to be.
Yeah, so time's flying. So it seems like only yesterday we started down the road of identifying what the certification program would look like, or even starting with pure requirements for such a document authenticity type program. But it has been over a year, and it kind of goes back to one of the biggest things that I talk about when, looking at benefits to certification. So why would an organization want to go through certification? And a lot of it goes back to standardization. And that's kind of what I feel like the start was, because there were a lot of vendors out there with these types of products, and there was no real benchmark performance requirements, to meet. So it was more like, organically working together to have these products in the marketplace, and, looking at, FIDO Alliance and, its incredible certification program within the authenticator certification, server certifications, as well as, the upstanding the biometric certification program. We're very well versed in, identity and access management, identity, authentication, authorization. Just seems real fitting for FIDO to get into this workspace. The program itself has gone through many iterations, working with vendors who are experts in the development of these products and the implementation of these products to define what that baseline performance should look like. And then setting up the policies and procedures around the certification program, and also looking to labs that actually work in this space and do the evaluations on these types of products, and standing them up to be the accredited labs to conduct the evaluation based on the requirements and test procedures as defined by the working group itself. So I think it was interesting, when Amy was talking about like being in the UK, one of the labs that we did accredit is a UK lab, and they have a lot of experience in this. And when I went and trained that lab, we had a lot of conversations about some of the vendors that they had already done evaluations on, just as tests, not against the FIDO requirements, but just in general within this environment, and how much bias actually exists in these products, to the point to where some of the evidence that from their testing was a little bit shocking to the vendor itself. So I think it's really important that we do have a certification program that a vendor can achieve and be able to prove or validate that their products meets these requirements, and rather than coming out with a product that might not meet the benchmark and be labeled as biased. So it's definitely something that you would want to avoid in such a high profile area.
Thanks. And I recall the origins of the program. I mean, one of the things we've seen the last few years has been this explosion of companies that are all saying, oh yeah, we do that too. It almost reminds me of the Star Wars movie Attack of the Clones, where, we're now seeing 50, 60, 70 companies that say, oh yeah, take a picture of your driver's license or passport with a smartphone and take a selfie and we'll match it. And ours is the best. And of course, the one thing that is true, if you have 60 vendors in a room, is they can't all be the best. The performance is going to vary quite a bit. And, at FIDO, it was actually a lot of the members who are buyers of these types of solutions, be them banks or tech providers, health insurers, who I think helped lead the charge with some of the vendors. In fact, FIDO was one who was, there with a couple of its competitors saying, why don't we standardize this testing so that there's actually a good, unbiased, neutral party who can say how this stuff works, rather than just having to deal with 60 vendors all making the same claims. Where is the program at in terms of what might we see in the market later this year with certification, since I know it hasn't formally launched yet?
Yeah, so right now we are kind of like in a beta phase for the document authenticity certification program. And the goal is to kind of have a couple beta vendors go through to, test against the procedures and the requirements to see whether or not they can achieve the benchmarks that have been identified. So the performance criteria that's currently identified, and provide feedback to the group. With this, we plan to take all the information back to the working group itself, make any modifications necessary to those requirements. And then the goal is to launch early in, late Q1, early Q2. So we're looking more like a March timeframe for launch of that. And then in addition to that, because that's not the stopping place for the Alliance itself, is that there is also another working group or subgroup within that framework looking at the selfie match requirements. So that is also something that vendors should look forward to and coming out later this year. We still have like policy documents and what the certification program processes and procedures look like, but the requirements are well underway in their development for that piece of it. And while there are two independent programs, a vendor could come with a complete end-to-end solution and certify under both. So, we're going to make that also an option to anybody in this this space to be able to either go with just the straight document authenticity or just selfie match, or a combination of both.
Thanks. And whether for Ray or Amy or Jordan or Brighton, would love your take in terms of how testing programs like this can actually sort of help us get to a ground truth on AI-enabled solutions, and whether there's a bias issue or whether there isn't, what works and what doesn't. How should government and industry be looking at all of this?
Yep, I'm happy. Go ahead, Brighton.
I was going to say on the testing issue, I think it's important to keep in mind that we're looking for flaws in the system, but you might find a system that's flawed. Like I said, it can be repaired, but even if you find a system that's flawed, it still might be better than a human run system. So when we're doing outcome system testing, we should be measuring against perfect to see if it's a good system, but also measuring against what we're currently using, what's currently available, to see if it's at least a better system than what we have currently. And I don't think we can let, perfect be the enemy of the good. It's going to be an incremental improvement. We're still innovating in this space. So I think that both of those comparisons are important to keep in mind.
Thanks. Jordan.
Yeah, I would say, I agree wholeheartedly with Brighton. And what I would add is that, and just looking at, the trajectory of Secure and, the models that we use today, right? We didn't start off, we have a goal of, being able to perfectly classify 100% of good identities and eliminate fraud as it exists for every applicant transaction on the internet. But what I would say is that we didn't start there, right? And so these are iterative improvements that get made over time. And I think it's important to really focus then on the outcomes associated with it and being able to address and adjust models as needed in order to seek, optimal performance.
Yeah, and Jeremy, as you mentioned, FIDO was there at the beginning of the conversation with the FIDO Alliance on this, and so feels really strongly that standards and certifications are important to understand what different vendors are able to provide and what the outcomes are. And so we view it as a really important tool for policymakers and for industry users as they're looking at these different new technologies, because as Jordan points out, none of us started where we are. We're building something that's growing, and that technology is constantly changing. And so we need to have a way to be able to understand what it is that it's producing.
Yeah. I wanted to come back to a point Brighton makes. I think it's an important one, which is as you're looking at how well newer systems perform, including those that use AI, what is the threshold we're trying to measure against? And, I thought it was a great point, which is, it may not have to be perfect, but if it's materially better than, the legacy systems it's replacing, that's an improvement. I often, joke, but only half jokingly, we named this group the Better Identity Coalition and not the Solve Every Problem in Identity Coalition, because nobody really knows how to do the latter. But there are some things that industry and government, collaborating together can do to make things materially better. And I think, one of the issues where at least I've been concerned right now is we look at some of these tools, whether it be for ID verification or other places where AI and machine learning are being used in the identity space. There's a concern that it's only going to hurt people. But I think there's ways that we're actually being able to show, measurable improvements, whether it's, better accuracy or in some cases, more auto approvals of applications, which, can lead to more inclusion. And, wondered if, any of you, all of you could all sort of jump in on some of the things you're seeing there.
So kind of piggybacking on what Jordan was talking about, digital identity verification in this space really helps with access. And FIDO's story starts with a founder whose parents were immigrants and having trouble being able to verify and authenticate. And so I think it's really a great opportunity to be able to help folks with thin credit files be able to access things that they rightfully should be able to access and not being held back because their name changed or they recently moved to this country or for any other reason don't have a credit history that allows them to access services.
I think to add on to there, Secure cares deeply about this issue. We even went forward and put out a white paper related to digital identity inclusion and fairness in particular. And what I can tell you is that, if you're looking at testing for outcomes, from there, we were asked by, we started off in the financial sector. We were asked by banks to perform basically a disparate impact assessment and see, what lift effectively we could generate. I would say if you're looking at outcomes and, how you improve over time for things like, the Generation Z, we were able to get 99% lift, those 62 and older, 16% lift. Male population, 18% lift, female, 21% lift, Asian, 46% lift, and African-American, 28% lift, right? And so there's results out there that empirically showcases how the tools and tactics and techniques that we're using today can allow us to actually get more people through the door ultimately, and therefore helping to, increase what would be that equal access for individuals.
Thanks. And, while I'm an optimist about the technology, I don't want to seem like I'm naive in that there are places where some companies are going to get this wrong. And where, things, I think it was Brighton who mentioned before, in many cases, it's not necessarily the algorithms, but the inputs that are being given, the people who are designing them aren't really thinking about, topics like inclusion and equity. I wonder if I could ask, Jordan and Secure as two vendors in the space, what do you all do on your side, to be proactive, if anything, to try and get ahead of these issues and actually make sure that, there isn't somehow bias, that, even if unintentional, is going to end up, excluding some people?
Yeah, no, absolutely, Jeremy. And look, it's an important question. And what I would say is that unfair bias and the associated friction that it introduces to what would be the underserved populations or those that are younger and high growth digital channels really results in abandonment rates of, I would say, 50% or more. And it helps, it basically leads to limiting access for those populations, right? So how do we work through it? And I would say the work for us is ongoing. I work with much smarter individuals, number of data scientists who come from, wide range of backgrounds. And what I would say is that, we focus on, I would say, probably three areas overall. I mean, one is expanding the data that is used to fuel the decisions and models that are developed. Instead of just credit data, which I mentioned earlier, we look to expand to other sources, right? You look at education, you look at telecommunication, utility. We're actually connected, and I think previous panels talked about ECBSB and how that is used, right? We're connected with them in particular, and we take that data and we use it in a way to help improve our models and expand our ability to, again, develop what would be, the predictive view of what is a good identity ultimately. The second area we look at is the demographics of potential impact for a particular use case, and then working to prioritize our roadmap such that we're looking at percentage of transactions where a particular bias may occur, and then we really just take a hard look and focus on solving for that bias in particular, and then optimizing such that it is available for everyone. So I mean, to paint an example of it, right? You look at natural language processing that may be used when you're doing matches of names, et cetera, right? A lot of static edit based techniques, and don't need to know what that is in particular, but what I would say is it's just a more simplistic view, which allows you to match names. They have a positive bias towards Anglo-Saxon names, averaging 6 characters in length, and a negative bias towards Southeast Asian names, we're averaging 3 to 5 characters in length, and depending on the country of origin, of course. And so, we use various techniques, take token-based, sequence-based, and dynamic edit in order to allow us to improve our models overall and optimizing our ability to recall and do that matching. And then the third area, just to quickly touch on, and I mentioned earlier, is really promoting more of what I would say is that thought leadership or innovation within our teams. Right, 95% of our data scientists that come in are from industries outside of identity and fraud overall. Now, what does that do? That actually gives us diversity of thought and taking nuanced approaches to what would be some of these harder challenges. It's almost, if you're working in a space for a long period of time, it's sometimes harder to think creatively about how you can solve it. And so, a lot of the experts that we have today are able to, just take a different approach to it, and it allows us to, obsessively work towards making those improvements that are needed to our models to increase access for individuals.
So FIDO has always been really focused on making sure that we're addressing bias and believe firmly that identity is the key to access. So, we are always continuing to work on our models. As I mentioned, and the ICO sandbox was a really important tool for us, but not to repeat a lot of the things Jordan just said, where I think you can find a lot of similarities between our two companies. But we recently just brought on board our first director of diversity, equity, and inclusion at FIDO. And so I think she is going to bring a lot to our company and help us continue to think about this, and has a lot of opportunity, both internal and how our product works, to think differently.
Thanks. Shifting back to Brighton, it's, the start of 2022. It's an election year, so maybe not a lot's happening in Congress, but this is an area where I think the AI task force and the Financial Services Committee seems to have been working on a pretty good bipartisan basis. What sort of policy activity should people be thinking about in the year ahead?
I think the biggest threat in this space is any kind of legislation or regulation born out of misunderstanding and fear. I think when we see a rush to regulate a new technology, it's usually an attempt to mitigate bad outcomes, whether those are real or perceived. So we've seen a couple of pieces of legislation on digital ID, none dealing with bias directly, but Mr. Foster and Mr. Loudermilk have a bill. Mr. McHenry had a bill in the 116th Congress related to Social Security numbers. So I think we'll continue to see regulation in this space. I think the most helpful thing that industry can be doing is to have really frank conversations with policymakers about areas where we should reasonably expect there to be bumps in the road, and demonstrate that industry is taking those concerns seriously and working towards solutions. And there isn't this dire need for imminent overburdensome regulation, which really is what we're doing here today, right? I think with a lot of this in the D&I space, it's kind of a show your homework exercise, for lack of a better word. If you're not achieving your goals, it's a discussion about what you're trying, why that is or is not working, how you're learning from those failures. If you are achieving your goals, what is working? Can you share those successes with competitors in your industry or other industries so that everyone can learn from those? Again, it doesn't have to be perfect, as long as we can show that we're moving in the right direction, that we're improving upon current systems. I think beyond that, we need to have an honest conversation about what sort of oversight or regulation is most effective. It's the whole hammer and nail thing. I think regulatory right sizing is really important in this space. There is a cost benefit analysis here. I think, like I said, the promise of AI is that it can be far better than human decision making. So with that in mind, as we work on improving these systems, we need to balance the benefits of AI tools against the risks and continue to mitigate those risks. But I think we should avoid a rush to regulation that's going to be really burdensome and hamper further innovation and iteration in this space, and could hamper improvements in this space that really can expand access to people who have not traditionally had access to these tools. Beyond regulatory right sizing, I think the final piece is it's important to craft something that will not be obsolete in a few years. I think whenever you're regulating technology, there is an urge to legislate based on what we're seeing in the market right now, but these systems are evolving so quickly that we need to be really careful not to be too technically specific in regulations. so that they don't become outdated in just a couple of years.
Yeah, I think we've certainly seen that before, where you can, point to a technology rather than a principle, and then suddenly the technology changes, and you're, left with a law or regulation on the books that is no longer relevant. I wanted to note, actually, as you were talking about, both, the concerns about policies that might race forward, in an effort to try and prevent harm, but may end up causing more harm. And also talking about Congressman Foster and Loudermilk's bill, which, emerged from some of the work that the Financial Services Committee has done on this issue the last couple of years. When Better Identity Coalition commented about 10 days ago, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy had a big RFI looking at biometrics and identity verification. And we, broadened it a little bit to say, well, biometrics are one place where AI is being used, but, here's our thoughts on these broader issues. One of our recommendations to them was that the best thing that the government could do to address concerns about, algorithms or analytics run amok that are trying to predict something is to advance the Foster-Loudermilk proposal, because that actually ties into the authoritative sources in the government, where government is the one authoritative issuer of identity that's out there. Being able to bring in, more attribute validation services, like we talked about in yesterday's panel. SSA has stood this up today with the ECBSV system to just give yes, no answers. Is there really a Jordan Burris with a particular date of birth and SSN who's still breathing? That alone, is a determinative factor that can augment some of the predictive tools that are out there to get better outcomes. And so we're, looking forward to more discussion with OSTP and other policymakers on that front. We've got just a couple minutes left. I see we have a question in the queue from Christian Bear, who said, last year, the General Services Administration released the Digital Worker Identity Playbook to help agencies determine the risk of digital worker identity management. I think this was tied to remote workers in the government. Was curious if anyone on the panel has seen this playbook being used in the ID proofing space.
So given at that time I was working in government, I would say that I haven't seen it be used largely towards the identity proofing space. I would tell you that, a lot of focus right now has been, or leading up into this moment in time, has been on, tracking, if you will, entities and how they operate within an environment, how you're looking at authentication events and things like that overall. And what I'll tell you is that, while authentication has gotten better, and you've heard all the ways in which FIDO and others are working on that, identity verification has just gotten harder, right? And we're seeing increases in folks not being able to get through the system, to get through the funnel. We're seeing increases in fraud overall. And so I definitely, looking at that particular issue, I would say it was probably a little more nuanced and dealt more with the life cycle, if you will, of an entity. But there's definitely opportunity for the government to really take a hard look at what is being done for identity verification. We know that NIST is looking at, updating would be 863 publication. I definitely think there's tons of improvements that could be made overall to just help advance the ball in this space.
Thanks. Any other perspectives on that question? One thing Ray, I wanted to come back to you a little bit to talk about, you mentioned, FIDO's rolling out the certification program. It'll focus first on the document authentication side, and then the selfie match component will come in later. Knowing that the document authentication side, we might see in a couple months, the ability to start piloting that certification program. Can you go into a little bit more detail about what are the things that the labs will be testing for when, different vendors, perhaps Secure and Onfido, and others come through to, test how those solutions work?
Yeah, so I first want to go back to a comment that was, or, a conversation that was being had before, is like, coming out with products, they might not be perfect to start. There might, in the certification program, we've identified a baseline. Like, this is the benchmark performance criteria for the certification. And when we launched the biometric certification program, we kind of had a baseline there as well. And what we realized is that while some vendors were able to achieve it, a lot weren't. And it kind of like manifested in this way that right now we just went through a major change in that criteria. And, at first it was like 20%, and now we're looking at 7 and 15%, on the different types of, performances, specific to, pad testing. So there was considerable change, within the marketplace. And I imagine the same thing will happen with this program as well once we launch it and kind of get vendors through the certification. Specifically, it's broken down into 2 sections. So there is a document verification piece of it. So you're looking at fraudulent documents and real documents like authentic. I was trying to think of a word. The authentic documents, and so there's different tests for that. The document reject rate, false reject rate, false accept rate, and things like that. The second aspect of it is the physical documentation. So actually having individuals physically come to the location to test the device with a physical document. So then there's also, just accept rates and reject rates defined within the program for that. So those are the 2 main areas in which this program does the evaluation for document authenticity verification.
Thanks. Another question from the audience, Ann Walwork asked, is industry working with NIST to update its digital identity guidelines, special publication 800-63, on testing to, I think to paraphrase it, to reflect the tons of improvements that can be delivered on identity verification that Jordan just mentioned? Is there an opportunity for public-private partnerships or closer collaboration on testing and standards development?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess to start off, and always great hearing from you, Ann. We are absolutely looking to partner with government to solve this challenge. I would say that when Secure launched its public sector business last year, it was the intent of helping government work these challenges in particular. I've seen firsthand from my time working in the White House how the work that's being done in identity, albeit great, right, can leave a number of folks out of the process overall. And so as we have more things moving online and remote, we're looking to maximize opportunities. So I would say absolutely, we're looking to provide commentary, do roadshows, educational campaigns, if you will, to have more robust discussion on this topic and really, again, get us to a better place of maturity.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that industry is happy to always engage and give feedback and suggestions to the government and work as a partner here. I think that's something that really the Better Identity Coalition has done so well, particularly when you think about eCBSV and the partnership with SSA to move that forward. This is another area where I think that industry can really be useful.
Thanks. We've just got another minute left or so. I think we'll take a break after this before our next spotlight session with FinCEN and FDIC. Any closing thoughts from panelists before we wrap? What's the one thing we should have asked you today that we didn't get to ask you? All right, I guess we were completely thorough, covered everything we had to talk about in this. So you'll remember it as soon as we click off what it should have been. Thank you, Amy, Jordan, Ray, Brighton, really great discussion. We're going to take about a 3-minute break, and then we'll come back at 1:45 Eastern with Kay Turner and Sultan Megji to talk about the new FDIC FinCEN tech sprint in this space, how to measure the effectiveness of digital identity proofing services. So we'll be back in just a couple minutes. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. We are now going to be moving on to a session with FDIC and FinCEN. This will be a spotlight session. I wanted to introduce Sultan Megji, who's the Chief Innovation Officer at FDIC, and Kay, if you can get your camera and microphone activated. Kay is Senior Counselor to the Director of FinCEN, looking at digital identity inclusion and digital payment infrastructure issues. This was if I call it a last minute addition to the panel. Last minute's really Carol House telling us last night she was going to speak at around 10 last night, a little bit later today. But it was just about a week ago that FDIC and FinCEN announced an upcoming tech sprint focused on measuring the effectiveness of digital identity proofing for digital financial services. So I'm really thrilled that Sultan and Kay, who are leading this effort, agreed to come talk with us today about what they're hoping to accomplish through the tech sprint, where many of you might be able to potentially participate in this, and as well as have a broader discussion around the need for better digital ID solutions in the financial services sector. So welcome, both of you. I'm not sure between the two of you who wants to start it off, but would love to hear about upfront, why do FinCEN and FDIC each care about this topic? Why does it matter to your agency's mission?
Go for it.
Oh, I was going to say Kay's the expert here. We should let her go first. Well, here I'll say a few words and then Kay will correct me. How's that? So it's really straightforward. If you look at so many of the things that bring risk to the financial sector in the United States, they anchor on identity. You know, I'm an old school tech guy, so I go all the way back to the first attempts at digital identity back in the 90s. And we've been working at this for a long time. But the thing that's really exciting about it now is we have a decent amount of risk in the system that we've built systems around to navigate. But as new technologies, new products and services come into market, new discussions, you know, this is something that we need to innovate on. We need to drive new and interesting things into the system. And I'm just super excited to partner with FinCEN on this, and especially Kay, who's pretty much the coolest person in digital identity. And I'm just going to turn it over to her then to talk more thoughtfully about this than I can.
Thank you very much, Sultan. So for those that don't know me, I joined FinCEN in June. I'm in a newly created role in the director's office. And in that role, I get to see all the intersections of identity across all the work that FinCEN does. And that colors my view. And I've learned an enormous amount. And when I start to think about it, you know, I remember sitting back at this conference a year ago. So I wanted to take a moment, just thank Jeremy for inviting us to be able to speak about it, and also think about the road that I've traveled over the last year. This is a really important conference, and I thoroughly enjoyed it and look forward to it. And then secondly, I wanted to thank Sultan, because it was actually in the first conversation that we had together that I asked, how could we work together? And he said, how about a tech sprint? And they had originally, the FDIC came back and they proposed AML, BSA, countering CFT. And I said, what about digital identity? And so we started kind of thinking about it. And let me explain why identity is important to FinCEN. You know, its role in the financial sector is to safeguard it. As the primary administrator of the Bank Secrecy Act and the U.S. Financial Intelligence Unit. Our focus is on illicit finance, money laundering, and related crimes like countering the financing of terrorism. And we work with domestic regulators like the FDIC, law enforcement, and international partners in order to identify and investigate illicit activity across the industry. And when you think about all of those roles, identity is at the heart of it. But before we even talk about FinCEN, identity is at the heart of all financial services, and it's core to trust. And so we recognize that the ability to assess risk is only as good as your ability to figure out with whom you're engaging. And so it's pretty darn important to get that right. And I think when I sit back, for those that know, I was, prior to joining FinCEN, I was working the last couple of years on COVID-related programs. And I think COVID has highlighted the weaknesses in both our payments and our identity system. And it has made KYC that much infinitely more challenging. And so, when we were talking about this, we were thinking about we need complex modern tools to address the fact that we are increasingly more in a digital world. And we were already in a digital world. It's just that a lot of people don't want to go into branches at the moment. So we think about the fact that there's the uneven implementation of IT standards has led to data hacks and personally identifiable information. That combined with a lack of digital government credentials means it's hard. And you guys know, I'm speaking to the audience, right? It's hard to figure out who anyone is in a digital world. And so given that identity is a network business, we're excited to be here because, the whole point is to invite lots of different people throughout society to come and collaborate with us, because it's going to take the intellectual power and creativity of all of us to solve this weedy problem that is a shared problem. That was a longer version.
No, that's good. So tech sprint sounds really cool. What is a tech sprint exactly?
Well, a tech sprint it's something we actually borrowed from our friends at FCA and then customized it to fit our model. So I'll tell you about the FDIC tech sprints, which is the model we're using for this one. The idea is that a variety of participants, private companies, individuals, government agencies, nonprofits, and everyone in between partner up into groups and they submit proposals to us. And they say, hey, given the scope of your question, here is a hypothesis for something we would like to explore with you. And we go through a rigorous application and judging process, and then a select group gets brought in. And over roughly 6 weeks, usually, they have tremendous access to us. They have access to our staff, to our people. We point them to data. We point them to other stakeholders to help them prove that hypothesis. And at the end of that 6 weeks or so, we do a demo day. And we have thousands and thousands of people from all over the world who join the demo day, senior government, everybody, to look at what this outcome is. And what we're trying to do with it is really a couple things. Number one is to demonstrate that there have been so much advances in technology that you don't need 4 months and an 8-figure RFP process to look at something interesting. It's out there. There's some great stuff out there already. I mean, the identity community is a robust one that's been around for a long time. So I fully anticipate getting amazing applicants from every single person listing here. And I'm scanning all the names, and we'll remember this if you don't. The second big thing we like to learn from this is that we need to see what the state of the art that's out there and identify it with our view of what we think the art of the possible is. Because as we continue to go down these paths, more technologies, more activities, we absolutely have to figure out how to work together better. And just like with cybersecurity or any of these other issues we're struggling with, these are things that we are better together and we're stronger together. And so the final thing we get out of it is I think, helps the applicants, but it also helps us as federal agencies figure out what to do next. And so it's one of the reasons we picked proofing. There is never going to be one identity system to rule them all. We could call it the Sauron system or something like that. That won't go anywhere. I mean, back in the X509 days, we tried something like that and it failed epically. What we know is it's going to be a network. We know it's going to be a federated network, and we know that we're going to have to figure out how to establish trust between different systems, and trust that can be independently audited and risked against, which, by the way, mimics the exact structure those of us in the federal regulatory community do, because we don't, most of the time, we don't go dot I cross T through a firewall configuration of a bank or a broker. We see that they have the systems in place to manage that effectively. Well, great. We have a framework, and we have now an opportunity to create a parallel model that allows us to identify how to ensure that we trust the various identity systems that are out there.
Thanks.
So
go ahead, Kay.
Can I just 1 second? I figure, you mentioned the problem statement. Maybe we should tell the problem statement. So it's the question is what is a scalable, cost-efficient, risk-based solution to measure the effectiveness of digital identity proofing to ensure individuals who remotely present themselves to financial institutions are who they claim to be? A mouthful.
Got it.
Go ahead.
And why is it you chose to focus on this topic versus others in identity? What was it about this one that stood out?
You want to go?
Okay. Oh, I was waiting for you. So one of the things I like about proofing is it's got two components to it that I get excited about. Number one is it allows us to really look at a lot of robust and mature activity that's out there, because there is good activity out there. I think, I just heard the tail end of the FIDO discussion, which has got obviously some great activity going on in there, right? The second thing is it is eminently usable. Right. This is not a 3-year research project. This is not something that we're going to sit on for a while. I think, I personally am very, I think digital identity is one of the things that's really going to make or break 2022 in a lot of ways. And we have to get to a point where we're having this. There are tremendous digital identity conversations going on in the market, going off in government and a variety of other places. We have to start closing the loop on this. And this was one area where we saw a direct value that could be created and navigated for this. I don't know, Kay, you want to throw in a couple of other sentences there? This was my love.
Well, I would just highlight, we're on the precipice of some really interesting developments. The technology that's coming to the fore, we're looking at the emerging mobile driver's license environment where you've got dynamic evidence that's updatable and interoperable. That's one of the opportunities. Obviously, we've seen the challenges with exposed PII. And so when we think about digital identity proofing, it's foundational to financial services, and it's an entry point to other services on which you can build upon. And when we think about solutions, obviously, different financial products and different customers vary in their risk profile and their proofing requirements. And so a new client that has a low dollar debit card is going to have different risk than a long-term client that needs to do a large dollar transfer for its mortgage, or do a transfer to a wallet for a digital asset transaction. And so when we were thinking about it, we were thinking about the sense of there are lots of solutions out there. How can we measure the effectiveness of proofing and provide the capability to calibrate proofing commensurate with the risk of the client and the products? And certainly one of the other things that I think working with the FDIC has driven home is there are a lot of small and medium-sized banks that have limited resources. And so when we're thinking about it, within that, the long problem statement that I read out, one of the things is cost efficient. And so we're thinking about how do you square that in this increasingly digital environment?
It's a good point that, financial institutions that come in all shapes and sizes, and, the types of sophisticated things that a top 10 bank might be able to do with their, resources relative to a small community bank or a credit union often vary quite a bit. I mean, what are some of the disparities you see, whether it's an identity or just other security tools, that in terms of what's out there today?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a good question, Jeremy. I mean, roughly speaking, we have just shy of 10,000 depository institutions in the United States. Slightly more than 4,000 of them are banks. The rest are credit unions. There are roughly 50,000 fintechs or technology service providers to the banking system on top of that. So you have an incredibly large number, call it rough order of magnitude, 50,000 corporate entities just here in the United States. You have about 100 different regulatory bodies that you have to interact with in the same way. You look across those and you can have something as small as 20 people in rural Missouri, an old ag bank that has, a fairly small amount of money, and they manage everything through a paper ledger or a copy of, a version of a spreadsheet installed on somebody's computer from 6 years ago. And you have a big scale up, right? All the way to the largest in the land. At FDIC, we kind of deal with that kind of middle to small group of financial institutions, right? We don't, the Fed and OCC manage the biggest, 50 basically. We deal with everyone else. And so, we can't have a system we can't have a program like this that precludes having some very, very advanced internal technology. We can't have a system like this that precludes having a technology staff of 30. You have to get up into the billions of assets in banks to have a technology team more than 10 people usually. That's, kind of an average. And, of those 10 people, you've got people running around worried about cable modems and photocopiers and, desktops and stuff like that. So, we have a big amount of disparity. And so we have to think of ways that allow these organizations not just to, prove that people are who they are when they're creating, wanting to open an account, for example, but as we look at transactional activity and audit and all the other things these entities have to do, we have to have systems that are kind of fit for purpose for the entire spectrum.
Thanks. Love to dive into more. How is the tech print structured? What kind of participants are you seeking? Is it open to companies, nonprofits, individuals? What does an ideal mix of participants look like?
Yeah, all of the above. I think I kind of highlighted that we're looking for all of those. If you look back at our last few tech sprints at FDIC, I have noticed the strongest teams include active participants in the financial sector, so banks, credit unions, along with technology providers, along with organizations, usually nonprofits or academics that have a specific, question set that they're asking. And then they partner together on a team to work together. That has historically been the most exciting ones. And you can look at the FDI Tech website off fdic.gov, and you can read about some of those and some of the previous winners. But, for us, one of the reasons we leave the problem statement fairly vague is we're looking for that creativity from people like everyone listening to our voices right now. Because I know for a fact that there are people, and I can see a lot of the chats and the Q&A, flying by, really good thoughts there, that there are people who have spent their careers trying to figure out some of these really gnarly problems. And this is a great opportunity for them to step up and participate in the discussion.
Great. And, it's, I think, a 2 to 3 week sprint. The announcement talked about, what does life look like if I'm part of a team during the sprint? If I'm somebody who's on the fence about applying when this opens up later this month.
Do you want the positive reinforcing answer or the slightly?
I mean, is there food, water, and sleep provided?
We're a government agency, so you can provide your own food and sleep. When I've done these in the private sector, I lock somebody in a room and slide pizza under the door usually. But no, we leave it to the organizations to really define the resources they want to put into it. We don't do that. I'm trying to keep these so close to what we do in the private sector because we're trying to get to that value. Some groups, it's great. Lock them all in the room and they'll figure something out over a weekend. Other groups, they need to, have emails and meetings and all the other stuff. We aren't precluding how people work together. We're just saying you're going to enter it with a proposition. You're going to have access to the SMEs and the resources appropriate that we've designated for this. And then on the back end of that, you're going to have a result that you get to talk about. And we want it to be open and creative and thoughtful. And I'm sure, if you look at some of the other ones, like our inclusion tech sprint, if you look at the 3 winners, those could not be 3 more different projects. You had one of the largest tech companies in the world, and you had a community-oriented group, that was 3 people. So there's quite a heterogeneity.
Let me actually ask you about the inclusion piece, since it's something we talked about quite a bit in our last panel. I mean, I would, sort of summarize it as saying there's a lot of different companies innovating in this space when it comes to remote digital identity proofing. A lot of them are using AI and machine learning in really constructive ways and being thoughtful about it and, working with outside experts on how to engineer it in a way that there aren't, material bias concerns. A lot of companies aren't doing that. How do you guys look at that as a factor when you're looking at measuring the effectiveness of these solutions in terms of, effective for whom?
Well, I'll let Kay throw her thoughts in here, but for me, I look at the outcome, right? A well-defined problem statement, a well-defined thesis from one of the teams coming in will make it very clear what a good result looks like. I spent most of my career in the private sector, so I don't like process for the sake of process. I want process because it leads to a positive outcome. And this is an area where we need some positive outcomes, right? So that's, in as much as I'll be judging some of these, that's one of the things I'll be looking for. Kay, you want to throw in a thought or two there?
Well, I think, when we think about inclusion, it comes in both the universe that applies. So to the extent that there's an organization that you think it's relevant to, please forward the invitation, encourage people to apply. And, we certainly have had that in the back of our mind as we sit and we think about the problem statement. I think we've approached it. You'll see in the larger write-up, we make references to MDI and CDFIs, and then we talk about the affordability bit of it. we're also thinking about on the judging side, how we end up doing it. Because we do think it's quite important. And we're looking at all of these issues and watching standard setters, et cetera, and thinking about how you can address inclusion. It's kind of the second, as you mentioned, the second of my responsibilities. So we're hoping to drive down the cost of financial services through being able to proof people more effectively. There's both a direct and a secondary implication to inclusion, I think, that some of the time people don't think about. So we're hoping to hit on both of those.
Thanks. Got a couple of questions coming in from folks. One is, can multiple companies apply and ask to be grouped together as a team, or does the government decide who's going to be on what team?
No, I would say if groups want to work together and put a single application and reference, all the teams and all that stuff. We aren't putting teams together.
Got it. And if participants are worried about protecting their IP,
their IP is their IP is their IP from our perspective. They aren't gifting it to us. We don't have access to it. If there's anything that you want to, redact when you're making a presentation, redact it.
Got it.
But the presentations are public, right, Sultan? Yes. And they'll be posted on the FDIC website.
They will. And there'll be a recording of the presentations and everything. So,
all right. So this is something people should be going in, keeping that in mind.
Definitely put all your source code in there, and definitely just like scroll slowly through it, right?
Another question from the audience. When you talk about identity proofing in relation to financial services, is this, looking at something like name, date of birth, and SSN, or are there other things you're looking at as well?
Kay, do you want to jump in? I mean, the short answer is it's much broader than that. I mean, it's the entire scope of PII. And then you also remember that, especially with both of our agencies, identity is not just when you open an account or want to open an account. It's also what you're doing with that account. So, you might be wiring money around, you might be, connecting it to fintechs and a variety of other areas where, especially if the account we're talking about is with a bank, there are rules around that. And so, it can be, transactional data, it can be, sender receiver, the metadata around that. There can be a lot more data behind that.
We've focused, I think, on the identity proofing bit. And, when you're talking about solutions, Sultan, maybe I'll throw out 4 of the kind of outputs that we suggested might be possible solutions, although we underscore there is no one size fits all, and we're looking for broad. But we highlighted in the large write-up that you'll find measuring the effectiveness of digital identity proofing on the FDIC website. We talk about a scoring model, research-based observations to enhance existing solutions, AI, machine learning, programming applications to red flag questionable IDs that would potentially lead to a dynamic scoring model, or other technological solutions to answer the question problem statement that I read out earlier. So again, it's very broad, but we have focused kind of on the front end, but the front end being foundational to and an entry point to other financial services. It's more on the proofing than it is on the authentication.
Got it. Another question. What are the rules for participants? Do I have to be an American?
There are a few rules, but I would say when we announce the application process here, which is coming up shortly, you'll see what it is.
All right.
So we're working on both the prize criteria, the criteria on which you'll be judged, and also the applicant criteria. And I think, building on what Sultan said earlier, we're looking for a broad set of people, not just engineers and technologists, but problem solvers from all different walks of life, because we're looking for diverse groups that are going to come out with new ideas and concepts. And I listed off, a couple that are possible, but obviously we're looking for new ideas, big concepts.
Got it. I see another question coming in. This might be getting in the weeds a bit. If I'm doing a demo, will FDIC and FinCEN cover the cost of the cloud hosting environment for the demo day?
You want the short answer is no. All
right. That's an easy answer. And I asked about this a little bit before, but I'd love to get a little more specific. Again, for those who aren't familiar with tech sprints, what have been some of the most impactful ones that FDIC's done? I mean, were there some things you can point to in the market that things are different now that did not exist before we had done one of these?
Sure. So, we've done two that I'll highlight. We did the most recent one we did in the late fall was on resilience. Operational resilience is a critical issue, right? As we become more and more technology dependent, and there's more and more heterogeneity of technology in the market, mainframes from the 80s all the way through to, the latest and greatest, digital crypto wallets that people have on their phones, right? All of that exists, in parallel with each other. And so we did one that really ended up with a great amount of work focused, and it was a little narrowly focused on the banking system because obviously that's our primary remit. But what it came to a variety of discussions, sadly, not a lot of which I can talk about publicly just yet, but it did cause us all the way deep in the bowels of our policy shops and all the way through the technical teams that actually evaluate banks at FDIC to kind of throw some new questions in, throw some new thoughts in, tweak how we do things. And so from an FDIC perspective, it was incredibly valuable because we have to get better at operational resilience, and I'll highlight one great example. Climate is not something that we can ignore. The easiest way to think about it is, let's just say there's a bank in the Midwest, but they happen to have a lot of commercial real estate mortgages for small businesses in, around Miami. Right? In the traditional model of how we do risk analysis, that, we wouldn't necessarily catch that on a first run. And now we're paying a little bit more attention to, for example, geography of where assets are that sit on a bank balance sheet. The second one we did slightly earlier was on inclusion. And that one was very interesting because we were trying to solve what we call the last mile problem. There are a lot of people who in this country who, they sit at home and they can't walk to a bank branch. They can't walk into a bank and just find the products and services they want. And so how do you get there? And so how do we create easier on-ramps for digital capture and onboarding of people? So that, like I say, you're sitting at home, you have your smartphone, your laptop, your phone, whatever, any sort of technology, you could sign up for a bank account right there. And it doesn't matter if it is the biggest bank in the country or it's a very tiny bank because you're, again, let's say in a rural part of the Midwest, right? You want to work with the bank that is right down the street from you in many cases. And so we don't want to just force everyone to go, smartphone full bore. I know my mom would never go for that. She always likes knowing that she can drive by the building of the bank. And there are a lot of people who feel that way. And so there was one project, and you can look at the website. I as a government official, I really have been programmed not to use the names of companies, so I won't. But there was one project where they created a very modern digital onboarding platform that could connect to legacy banking technology. And that really hadn't existed in the way until after this tech sprint. And that is a piece of technology that's out there that banks are signing up for. And it makes it very easy for the local bank to give people a place to sign up online for a bank account.
And so it sounds like the outcomes could be a couple things. One, it could be somebody might come out of this and start a company based on what came out of a tech sprint.
Absolutely. In some cases, it's a company. In some cases, it's a new product for an existing company or companies. In some cases, it might be a research paper. We've had all of the above. And to us, all of them are successes.
Yeah. Well, and I think the other thing that stood out from what you were just saying a couple minutes ago was another outcome may just be that you present something in a way that causes the regulators to start to rethink how they're looking at an issue, which in and of itself, look, certainly knowing how much people spend in this town trying to influence regulators, it's a unique education opportunity, perhaps.
I could not possibly comment on the last half of what you said, but I would say that I think, for those of us in the DC, in the Beltway universe, it is a bit of an echo chamber. And so hearing from people who are out there doing this, really out there trying to help their communities, out there helping their constituencies, it's always great for us to hear this. Even if we don't necessarily agree with it, but when you have statute and regulation that goes back to the 1930s, we've obviously, through the lifetime of our agency, had to do things to keep it fresh and keep it up to date. And the pace of technology change, the pace of the demands from the average American that we have to protect and serve here, there is a lot of evolution there, and we've got to get faster. And so this is a great opportunity for us to hear things in a much faster timeline that potentially also allows them to get into the market in a faster way.
Got it. And so I had one more question. I'm trying to go back and forth through stuff I want to know and what others are asking. if I participate in the tech sprint, can that be used in participants in their RFP response or in their marketing materials or go-to-market activities? So I think it's can I say I participated in this, then advertise that?
Absolutely. Don't ask us to validate and say that we would love your company or love your product, but certainly the rules do allow, and we do publicize it. So if you go and look at the tech sprint, you will see that we publicize, the companies that participate and stuff like that. So
got it. And then the other question was, are you interested in solutions that might go beyond just traditional remote identity proofing to support things that could be video, that could be in person, looking more holistically at identity?
I think that's a really great question, and I would love to see some hybrid or broad spectrum solutions. I mean, I will say that I spent a lot of time with the FIDO community quite a while ago, back when biometrics were just starting to become a thing, right? And that's not recently. And one of the things that we I think had a lot of great conversations about was the understanding that in many cases, great identity is multi-dimensional, right? It might be digital, it might be in person, it might be video, it might be other biometrics, it could be GPS geolocated, right? There are a lot of different ways, depending on the use case, depending on the kind of proofing you're trying to do to make something interesting. So if you have a reason to pull some of these together in a unique use case that you think is valuable, I think we'd love to hear it.
Yeah. And how many applicants, how many teams are you going to be selecting?
Open question, but I think Kay and I both kind of say 10-ish is probably a good number. I think too much more than 10 and people start knocking tapping out from other work and stuff like that.
Great. Well, I think that's all the questions I had from between me and everybody else. Are there any things we should have asked you today that we haven't yet?
I don't see anything. We also on the FDIC website have, if you have any follow-up questions that end up popping up, you can either contact me or Sultan, or you could pop an email into, I think it's innovations@fdic.gov. And we'd be happy to do it.
Yeah, it's innovation singular at fdic.gov. But if you just go to the fdic.gov/FDITECH, that's your kind of your one-stop shop for information and follow-ups and all that.
Perfect. And I think I had pasted something in earlier in the chat, but I will do it again one more time since the chat has scrolled up quite a bit. Really appreciate you, both of you, coming. I know Assistant Secretary Rosenberg is in the queue. We're going to kick off with her at 2:20. Thanks again for this. I hope you get tons of applicants and do awesome things from this. We'll take a 2-minute break and sort of swap you out and bring in the Assistant Secretary, and we'll be back right at 2:20. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Well, hello and welcome back. I am really pleased to introduce Elizabeth Rosenberg as our next keynote. For those who don't know Liz, she was confirmed last month as the Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes at the Treasury Department. Congratulations. Leading the office that formulates and coordinates counter-terrorist financing and anti-money laundering efforts at the Department of Treasury. That means she's essentially as Treasury's point person for making sure our financial system cannot be exploited by adversaries, be they criminals, terrorists, or other countries. I'll say this is not the first time she's worked in this space. She's actually had a long and distinguished career, including a couple of stints as senior advisor within other parts of Treasury working on these issues. She also spent several years as a senior fellow at the Center for New American Security. In fact, I think she and I met, I think it was right around the start of the pandemic when all of this chaos was happening around digital identity in her role at CNAS, doing a great forum on that side of things. But really thrilled she could come speak with us today. So Assistant Secretary, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jeremy. And thank you to the Better Identity Coalition, the FIDO Alliance, and the Identity Theft Resource Center for inviting me today. It's really a pleasure to help close out this forum. And as you noted, Jeremy, in your very kind introduction, I have had the ability to approach this set of topics from outside of government and from inside. And it continues to be challenging, interesting work. So I have a couple of thoughts that I had prepared to share with you today. And I want to start by sharing an observation I've made since joining this administration last year. Many of the critical problems plaguing our financial system stem from an inability to readily and reliably know who we're dealing with. So whether we're talking about people who shouldn't have access to the financial system, like money launderers, criminals, and those under sanctions, or those who should be able to access the financial system but who are excluded for various reasons, we're often talking about identity problems. So for example, when the pandemic started spreading widely, and Jeremy, you invoked it in your introduction, but we all, of course, remember that moment well, thinking back to March 2020, when Congress, as you all will all probably remember, Congress passed the CARES Act. That bill, among other things, provided expanded unemployment insurance for millions of people that COVID had put out of a job. And within 2 months, however, an international cybercriminal ring saw an opportunity. They applied for unemployment benefits using stolen personal identifiable information, PII, of citizens in Washington state. And within weeks, their scheme crossed the borders into Arizona, Hawaii. By the end of July, they had swindled the federal government out of potentially millions of dollars. And unfortunately, it wasn't an isolated case. The Department of Justice has charged hundreds of defendants in stealing COVID-related relief funds. There are also the people in another example who should have access to the financial system, but who don't. So survivors of human trafficking, for instance. We know one of the first things that traffickers do is strip their victims of their phones and IDs. They deprive them of their identity evidence, which means that when survivors finally gain their freedom, they emerge into a world with little ability to navigate it. They can't get a driver's license, they can't get a bank account. And that's only one very specific example. While many factors contribute to financial exclusion, too many people in this country lack easy access to the government-issued identity documents that are traditionally required to open a bank account. Rarely in public policy discussions do complex problems have simple solutions. And indeed, this is the part of the speech where someone in my position usually makes a caveat and says, our challenges require a constellation of actions, and there's no one silver bullet. But actually, in the cases that I've described, and in so many others, there really is a kind of a silver bullet, at least one of the closest things to it that I've seen in public policy making, and that's digital ID. Of course, integrating digital identity solutions presents technical challenges, to be sure, but it seems clear to me that as a policy matter, digital ID has the potential to immediately and dramatically improve how we protect our national security and our financial security. In fact, there's a coda to the stolen pandemic benefit story I was mentioning earlier. When some of the states, such as Arizona, recognized that they were being defrauded, they partnered with the digital ID company called ID.me Almost immediately, the fraud ring saw the game was up. Here's a quote. "Do you not understand PUA, also known as Pandemic Unemployment Assistance, is dead?" One hacker posted on a dark web forum. Another quote, "All the states are switching over to ID Me." But unfortunately, such anecdotes are still more the exception than the rule. The physical world is quickly merging with the digital world. Assets are digital, payments are digital, loan applications and disbursements are digital. The way we interact with institutions like banks and our government is increasingly digital. And yet our framework for identity proofing is still an artifact of a time when we would go to the bank and show the teller our driver's license in order to take out cash. This has created an explosion of the problems like the ones I described, and something that you all know well. These problems include everything from the mildly frustrating, think about how often we're asked to prove that we're not robots on the internet, to the endangerment of our national security. Here I'm talking about hackers spoofing identities to launch ransomware attacks on government IT systems, on our hospitals, on our pipelines, and on other critical infrastructure. And we also see how kleptocrats and other international criminals evade our sanctions by hiding behind false identities and empty shell companies. This is a road we simply cannot continue to travel if we do not treat digital ID solutions and digital ID infrastructure as basic public goods. If we do not rapidly implement them, then bad actors will increasingly exploit our inability to know who we're dealing with. They may even have more opportunities to commit fraud, money laundering, sanctions evasion, and cybercrime. They will cheat and violate the laws and regulations that are the bedrock of our society. And indeed, a society where you cannot trust that you actually know who someone is a very broken society. Treasury understands the efficiency, equity, and national security issues associated with our lack of a strong privacy-preserving digital identity ecosystem in this country. But now we must bring greater urgency and energy to solve the problem. Now we must better support industry, institutions, and all levels of government to innovate and implement interoperable digital identity technology and services. And today my message, first and foremost, is that's exactly what we're doing. At Treasury, we're approaching 2022 as a year of action for digital ID, a period in which we're going to undertake a series of measures to ensure that technology can be adopted as broadly as possible, as quickly as possible. So what will those actions be? What will this digital ID ecosystem look like? And just as important, what won't it look like? And I'll tick through a few characteristics now. First, I want to be really clear. We're not talking about a national digital identity system here, an official database of everyone's personal information housed in some federal agency. We don't have that now, and this administration won't propose creating one in the future. In this country, as you all know, much of the key information that can validate identity is held by the states and communities where you live. It's in driver's license and birth certificate files, and that won't change. Second, our digital ID ecosystem won't be monolithic. There are a variety of ways digital identity solutions can credibly validate identity attributes and verify the identity of a unique person. This means that there shouldn't be one digital ID technology or just one platform. We're talking about a diversity of technologies and services here, and it's the federal government's role not to pick just one, but to ensure that many of them can be developed and interact with each other. Indeed, all levels of government and the private sector must play a role in creating a secure, privacy-preserving, consent-based ecosystem built on open standards. One way we'll do that is through clear communication. This is the third characteristic I want to highlight of the digital ID ecosystem we're building. If we want to drive more innovation and adoption, we know government can't be vague in its guidance or half-hearted in its support. We recognize that there's significant work already underway by financial institutions and the technology industry to advance digital identity technology and solutions. At the same time, we look forward to working with the federal banking regulators and US government agencies on creating the right environment for digital ID solutions. I think clear regulation and supervisory expectations can really help drive digital ID adoption in the financial sector, including in the rapidly growing digital asset space. As we have consistently emphasized, digital asset providers need to comply with the Bank Secrecy Act in the same way traditional financial service providers do. Digital identity solutions can help them do that. Fourth point, the effectiveness of digital identity solutions and services depends on the ability to validate identity attributes against authoritative government databases. To do that, we're pushing to open up more databases. That means digitizing local and state databases and developing appropriate infrastructure and applications, such as mobile driver's license infrastructure that can support privacy-preserving identity attribute validation services. We're exploring the possibility of voluntary grants to help states do that. There are also new databases at Treasury that Treasury can make useful, including one we're creating on beneficial ownership. Since the early 20th century, some states have allowed anybody to establish a shell company without disclosing who really owns it, what we term the beneficial owner. That's about to change, actually. Thanks to Treasury's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, or FinCEN, we're now in the process of implementing the Corporate Transparency Act. A big bipartisan majority of Congress passed the law last year, and it mandates the creation of a national database of who owns what company. Last month, FinCEN issued a proposed rule to collect the necessary information that will help us build this database. It will require many US and foreign companies to report their true beneficial owners to FinCEN and to update that information when those beneficial owners change. Finally, and maybe the most important, any digital ID solution needs to protect people's privacy. Privacy protection is already a core element of the NIST Digital Identity Guidelines, Technical Standards, and Trust Framework, which was crafted to increase the ability to include privacy-enhancing techniques as a fundamental elements of identity systems. And for the American public, and privacy is enshrined in our federal financial sector regulatory regime. For the American people to trust digital identity, they must be able to trust that it affords them privacy. Like the rest of you, I don't want us to be addressing the same problems with when next year's forum convenes. At least I don't want to see the same problems happening as frequently to the same degree as they are right now. The 2023 forum should be a moment to celebrate progress, a time when we can look around the financial services sector and see a bigger set of digital identity validation and verification solutions available. Treasury is committed to making that happen, but let me close by saying this: we cannot do it alone. We need the private sector's help. We need your help in particular. We need you not just to build these technologies, but to work with us to ensure they are broadly implemented, to engage with the federal government, with states and communities, with privacy advocates, everyone who has a stake in this issue. And we need you through diligent, collaborative, and painstakingly credible work to give the American public confidence that the digital identity solutions are secure, voluntary, protect their privacy, and keep the bad guys out. And if we do that, then I'm confident we won't be living with a financial sector where more and more cyber criminals steal people's identities or synthesize new ones, where crime rings rob good people and defraud financial institutions, businesses, and the American taxpayer. Instead, we'll be living in a world with less digital fraud and fewer stolen identities, with stronger defenses against ransomware attacks, a world where all of us feel safer trusting an individual on the other side of our computer because we know who they are. And with that, I will end my remarks, and thank you very much.
Hey, thank you. I really appreciate you coming. I know schedule-wise, your staff said you didn't have time for questions. I'll just say, I love the idea of 2022 as a year of action. I definitely don't want to have the same conversation next year. And so we'll look forward to working with you. Really appreciate you coming today. Thank you so much. And we'll take a brief break. Our closing keynote will be Carol House from the White House National Security Council staff. She's scheduled to come on 2:45, so we'll break for another 10 minutes or so, and then we'll have Carol come on and wrap up with closing comments. So we'll be back shortly. Thank you, everybody. All right, welcome back. We have nearly arrived at the end of our program, but I'm really excited to welcome Carol House as our closing keynote. For those who don't know Carol, she's Director of Cybersecurity and Secure Digital Innovation for the White House National Security Council, the NSC. She spent a lot of time around this space. She joined NSC from the Treasury's FinCEN office. We just heard from Kay Turner about an hour ago on some of the work they're doing. There, she led work on cybersecurity, virtual currency, and emerging technology policy efforts as a senior cyber and emerging technology policy officer. Before FinCEN, she had a great stint at the Office of Management and Budget's Cyber and National Security Unit, as well as the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Government Affairs, working on cybersecurity and critical infrastructure protection policy issues. Notably, Carol's a former Army captain, served in chemical defense and military intelligence till November of 2014, including a deployment to Kandahar province in Afghanistan in support of Operation Enduring Freedom. She has a BA in international affairs from from a school, University of Georgia, who has a football team who broke my heart on New Year's Eve. But congratulations, go Dogs, woof woof. Also has an MA in Security Shield Studies from Georgetown University. Carol, really glad you could join us here today to offer some closing remarks as we wrap up this two-day event. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy, and go Dogs. Thank you also to the Better Identity Coalition, the FIDO Alliance, and the Identity Theft Resource Center for inviting me here today. It's incredibly hard to follow the great Liz Rosenberg, but I do appreciate the opportunity to try and join this policy forum to just very quickly offer a few perspectives from the National Security Council, many of the insights of which will just reinforce and summarize some of the great issues that have been discussed here earlier. First, I'll underscore that identity is a critical issue, and we see that the NSC sees it as one critical to national security. The rapid innovation in the internet and mobile phones has brought unprecedented convenience and efficiency to everyday Americans. When these same citizens interact with the physical world online, the experience is rampant with friction and opportunities for exploitation. The lack of strong identity amplifies this friction. So as digital payments and commerce and interactions continue to grow, there's an increasing need and opportunity for fostering development of strong identity solutions that can provide easy, secure, affordable, reliable ways to identify consumers and counterparties across digital systems. Last year, we saw the president commit, along with other G20 leaders, to welcoming the development of secure, trustworthy, interoperable digital identity solutions, and following that commitment to continue our work with international partners to explore such development. So that's going to be a critical part of focus for the National Security Council and the US government. We'll also be focused very much on the extremely complicated issues that we see surrounding identity, which includes looking at the implications for cybersecurity, economic growth, privacy. The list continues, but all of that really reinforces why dialogue at forums like this between government and industry are so valuable in helping us examine the various aspects of identity and the other complex technology and policy issues surrounding it. So first, since I do come from the NSC and the Cyber Directorate, I would like to speak briefly about President Biden's executive order on improving the nation's cybersecurity and our efforts to secure critical infrastructure, and specifically calling out the role that identity plays in all of them. So all of the initiatives underneath the EO and our critical infrastructure protection efforts, as well as digital identity, all these initiatives fit under the administration's cyber strategy. The first pillar being to build back better, to modernize defenses. The second, to return to the international stage with allies and partners. And the third, for being better postured to compete. The EO on improving this nation's cybersecurity was the administration's down payment on the first prong of this strategy. And identity plays a critical role in support of this strategy as well, also in the EO. So first, to help us modernize our defenses in efforts like what Eric Mills spoke to earlier this morning on Zero Trust. Identity can help us return to the international stage, given the significant potential applications for identity across borders and the continued work in the G20, as I mentioned earlier, and to be better postured to compete. Digital identity plays a key role to enable higher order developments for digital economies. So back to the EO and what really led to its issuance by the president. The EO reflects several lessons learned from recent major cyber incidents like SolarWinds, Microsoft Exchange hack, Colonial Pipeline. All of those major cyber incidents share some common traits that reinforce several lessons that we have taken to heart. The first, highlighting the urgent need for change. For too long, the public and private sectors have failed to take the necessary steps to modernize our cybersecurity defenses. We can't accept that we'll continue to move from one incident response to the next. Second, these recent incidents have highlighted, or not so recent anymore, highlighted the role that poor cybersecurity hygiene, including poor identity controls and poor software security, have played in making us more vulnerable to cyber attack. Security can't be an afterthought. It has to be incorporated at design. Deputy National Security Advisor Ann Neuberger has often said, I've seen in forums with industry, would you buy a car that requires you to install your own airbags? And I would encourage us to think about what does this mean for technology and service providers and how they should feel about basic protections that could help us readily and reliably know who we're dealing with, like, for example, strong authentication protections. The third lesson that was present in the issuance of the EO is that recent incidents have highlighted that everyone is a potential target. Government, large corporations, small companies, critical infrastructure, municipalities, they can all be targets of nation state and cyber criminal actors. And that also means that we all have a role in defending against this malicious activity. So at the end of the day, the cyber EO gets us closer to the end states that we're trying to drive at, preventing as many cyber attacks as possible, reducing the scope and scale of future cyber compromises, and helping us rapidly react and expel any successful intrusions. So now that I've outlined one of the key initiatives that we've driven from the National Security Council and with our partners across the Executive Office of the President and the U.S. government, I'll really underscore the role that identity plays in the EO. And it plays a critical role for good reason. Many cyber incidents that we've seen involve vectors of compromise that could have been thwarted through stronger identity and access management solutions, including implementation of multi-factor authentication solutions. We've also seen identity weaknesses as a culprit in significant amounts of cybercrime and cyber-enabled financial crime. Like synthetic identity fraud undermines identity verification. Account takeovers target weaknesses in authentication solutions. Business email compromise fraud targets weaknesses in authentication and verification between trusted counterparties that fraudulently induce a wire transfer to criminally controlled accounts. We've heard estimates from government agencies of account takeovers that amount in the hundreds of millions every single month and billions lost to fraud every year. All of these statistics point to the fact that something is not quite right in how we are authenticating and verifying identities for access to key services. And we've heard estimates also from industry that most ransomware incidents potentially could have been prevented through simple implementation of multi-factor authentication and implementing a zero trust architecture and the lessons from that. So under the EO, federal agencies are directed to adopt MFA and encryption for data at rest and in transit. When NIST published their preliminary guidance outlining security measures for critical software, that included guidance for establishing multi-factor risk-based authentication and conditional access across the enterprise. Identity also sits at the heart of zero trust. And I know that my colleague, Eric Mill, spoke to that earlier this morning, which the EO directs that agencies must develop plans to advance toward, consistent with the currently draft strategy that I know is coming out soon. Zero trust is critical for us to modernize our defenses. We can no longer depend upon perimeter-based defenses to protect critical systems and data. So again, just reinforcing the messages from Eric earlier, the draft federal zero trust strategy is going to help accelerate agencies toward a shared baseline of early zero trust maturity. And it pointed to identity as its first pillar. So we're very excited to see the progress and efforts taken by agencies and the leadership shown by OMB to help set us on a clear path in achieving our objectives towards zero trust. I'll underscore again how important the strategy's provisions are, taking advantage of passwordless approaches supported under FIDO 2 and WebAuthn standards, setting a clear bar of requiring phishing-resistant MFA for internal-facing government systems, which we believe is the baseline for the U.S. government. And we want to ensure that it's an option for public-facing systems. Identity protections have played a critical role in our engagement and use of our authorities to help secure critical infrastructure as well. Just last summer, DNSA Neuberger sent an open letter out to CEOs in the wake of major ransomware incidents, highlighting some of the basic cybersecurity provisions that industry could implement to better defend themselves against ransomware. And strong authentication solutions was one of the critical cyber hygiene controls that she pointed to. Identity also plays a key role in many other areas that the administration and the US government care about, whether it's countering fraud, implementing beneficial ownership requirements under the Corporate Transparency Act to help counter illicit finance and corruption, as well as our surge on resilience efforts under the US government counter ransomware strategy to improve cyber hygiene across critical infrastructure sectors and work in partnership with the cyber insurance sector. So I've highlighted a lot of those ongoing efforts. Obviously, there's a lot of great opportunity for partnership between government and with industry to support these efforts. So I would encourage all of you in industry to take advantage of forums and dialogue with the US government, with the White House. I'll call out the recently announced Financial Crimes Enforcement Network and FDIC tech sprint on identity, which I'm sure Kay spoke to earlier. I'm sorry I missed that session, which I'm sure will bear some really wonderful outcomes and great dialogue between industry and regulators. The White House is also going to continue exploring opportunities for areas where we can have the highest impact and focus on standards, services, or any messaging that can help us in refining and achieving the administration's policy objectives and identity. There's a lot for us to examine here and potentially leverage on issues like interoperability, equitable access, law enforcement implications, privacy, competition. And the administration will try to account for and consider all of these as we try to determine our approach toward digital identity. We'll continue to look at how we can leverage and shape ongoing federal efforts to support identity authentication and verification, like login.gov, attribute validation services, digital credential issuance, international and domestic standards. All of these are efforts that we're going to explore and determine if there's any particular steps that the White House should take in engaging to make sure that they support the administration's objectives on digital identity. So very excited to hear about Treasury announcing their year of action on digital identity and hopeful to continue to partner with them as they move forward. I'm sure that year promises to hold some real thought, leadership, and forward movement in this space. So hopefully then that's a good preview for the National Security Council's perspectives on the critical importance of identity in cybersecurity, as well as many of our other objectives on countering corruption, fraud, and building broader digital economies. We look forward to continuing to engage with all of you. And thanks again for the opportunity to speak with you all here today.
Thanks, Carol. I really appreciate you taking the time. I know you're busy and this was last minute, but I can think of nobody better to come in and give us closing remarks than you, given, I think that's the big question is it's identity authentication and the road ahead as the event name, lays out. And so it's good to hear about how the White House is starting to think about these things. So I know your time is quite tight. Thank you for joining us today. Really appreciate it. And with that, that brings us to our closing. So thanks to those of you who've stuck with us. I know Zoom conferences aren't nearly as fun as ones where you actually get to, go get a donut that, or a cup of coffee and, actually spend time with people and see people. But I think for the second year in a row, we've succeeded in putting on what I think has been a very good event. We've covered a lot of different facets of the, what I would call the identity conundrum, from looking at the massive fraud issues that we've seen and how we can address them in both the public and private sector, looking at the questions of inclusion and equity and how to make sure that as we're building systems to stop fraud and cybercrime, we don't leave people behind. Today, great discussions in the morning around authentication and the role that things like the FIDO standards is going to play going forward for the country. And really great discussions this afternoon, I think both with our panel and then with several rounds of speakers around next generation identity proofing and what we need to be thinking about there in terms of better standards, better testing and certification programs, ways to make sure that, as we're using artificial intelligence and machine learning, that we don't introduce bias into, these systems. And, as I can't think of a better way, to end this as well than, as we had Assistant Secretary Rosenberg say, let's make 2022 a year of action on digital ID. So on behalf of Better Identity Coalition, FIDO Alliance, the ID Theft Resource Center, we look forward to working with all of you in industry and government on making this that year of action. By the way, thanks once again to our producer, Dustin Loop. It's not easy to pull off an event like this in real time. None of this was taped. I do a lot of conferences where everything's recorded and cleaned up and made real nice. And then you're just, watching something that's, a previous recording. This was all live and a little unfiltered, but I think it made it a lot more interesting and time spontaneous in terms of the discussions we could have because of that. So thanks again to all of you for the time you spent with us. And we'll look forward to working and partnering with all of you again in the year ahead. 2022 is the action year of action for identity. Thank you.